Oh my goodness, Michael. You sure have grown up a lot since the last time we talked about the Medici family. Wow. Can you say hi to everybody? Can you say hi? Say hi. Can you blow him a kiss?
Yeah.
There you go. Can you give him a fist bump?
Boom.
Boom. Good job. All right. Okay, so in the last recorded slideshow lecture, I talked a lot about the Medici family and how they were creating the city of Florence. And in this next lecture, we are going to return to the Medici family. We're going to talk about Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici, those two brothers. The story is going to get really dramatic. But this time, in this recorded slideshow lecture, I'm going to go. You want to do another fist bump? Do another fist bump. Boom! Good. There you go. You want to give them a 5? All right, give them a 5. Boom! All right, they appreciate that. All right, they appreciate that. It's a lot more fun than hearing about the Medici. All right. Give him another, blow him another kiss. Yeah, good job. So anyway, we're going to return to the very dramatic story of the Medici family. Things get really interesting with Lorenzo de' Medici. But this time, I'm going to go way back, and I'm going to talk about the Greek and Roman culture and how it's coming back during the age of the Renaissance. You want to say goodbye? Can you say goodbye to everybody?
Goodbye.
Goodbye. All right. So as I was saying, in this particular lecture, I am going to continue with the story of Lorenzo de' Medici and the rest of the Medici saga. But I am going to start off by going all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans and talk. That'll help me help me explain what was being brought back during the period of time of the Renaissance. But here's what I want you to think about. So last time I encouraged you to think about, what makes a great city? Could Columbus, Ohio one day be one of the great cultural cities of the world? And if so, what would that take? What type of transformation would have to happen? And we saw that happen with Florence during the 14th and 15th centuries under the Medici family. So here's what I want you to think about this time. Here's how I want to introduce this particular lecture. If you were the king of Columbus and you were trying to turn Columbus into a great city, and you could educate everybody in a particular way, how would you educate them? So, and I'm not talking about really young kids, although you could think about them too. I'm talking about like teenagers and young adults, so like high school students and college age students. If you wanted to create a really vibrant society, an incredible city, how would you want your people educated? So as you think about that, you probably think about, well, okay, what are the problems with society today? What are people ignorant of today? And then how can we, create a new generation of better educated people, better educated being however you define being better educated, and in order to create, whatever type of great society that you wanted to create. So how would you educate people? Think about that, because Florence is going to educate their people in a particular way. And we'll learn about that this time as we continue our voyage through the Renaissance in AP European history.
All right. Hey there, AP European history students. This recorded slideshow lecture I have entitled The Medici Apex and the High Renaissance. Those are two different things, and I honestly had trouble coming up with a good title for this particular lecture because I'm going to be bouncing around a lot all over the place. I'm going to be going back and forth throughout history, which is typically not how I like to lecture. I like to lecture in a straight chronological fashion. But there's so much that I want to incorporate into this particular lecture that I will be forced to sort of bounce back and forth. I hope to do so in a way that still makes sense, and the narrative and the story and the chronology are all still very clear. So the Medici Apex and the High Renaissance, these are two different things. I'm going to be talking about the Medici family. I'll be picking up where I left off with Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici and what happens to them, and how Lorenzo de' Medici will be the height of Medici power. And then after his death in 1492 is a very important year. Lorenzo de' Medici's death is only but one important thing that happens in the year 1492. But after Lorenzo's death, the Medici family goes into decline for a period of time. And then the focus of the Renaissance then shifts. Florence has been the center of the Renaissance as it developed throughout the 15th century. But then after Lorenzo de' Medici's death and what happens to Florence that we'll learn about, the Renaissance shifts south to Rome. And the next big patrons of the Renaissance are going to be popes. And there's one pope in particular, Pope Julius II. Julius II patronizes Raphael and Michelangelo. And then Rome, for a period of time, becomes the center of the art world. And that shift to Rome as being the center of the Renaissance is the period of time that we call the High Renaissance. Everything before that, the Early Renaissance. Okay, so that's my title for this particular lecture. Now let's get into the lecture itself. I am going to return to the story of the Medici, but I want to back up and I want to go back to this guy. This is the individual that I started the whole class with, Petrarch, our scholarly, poetic mountain climber who celebrated the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, classical civilization. In his writings, in his lectures, in his poetry, he spoke about how fantastic classical civilization was, and then boom, 476 AD happens. We have the barbarians sack Rome, and Western civilization falls into a horrible decline that he called the Dark Ages. And then in the early 1300s, when he lived, he said the time has come to bring it back, to go back to ancient Greece, to ancient Rome, to get their civilization and to bring it back. But how do you do that? You can't get in a time machine and go back and bring back all those ancients to the current day. So how do you do that? Well, it's by sometimes literally digging up their culture, finding those lost books, learning those lost stories, reading the biographies of the great people from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, looking at their artwork, looking at their architecture. Those ancients had mathematics and science. We need to start learning those things again. And Petrarch advocates once we start doing that, then we will enhance our own civilization. So what Petrarch is advocating is a new form of education. And that new form of education means relearning all that stuff that had been lost when classical civilization fell in the 5th century. Okay, I need to introduce a very important term for AP European history. It's a term that you need to know. And that term is humanism. All right, humanism. What is humanism? Okay, well, in general, humanism means to celebrate being a human being, celebrate your life on earth here and now, to enjoy being alive here and now. That's part of humanism. Another part of humanism is to develop your full individual potential as a human being. Okay, so to celebrate life on earth and to develop your full individual human potential. Those are two primary qualities of humanism, but what exactly does that mean? So let's put this into historical context. When Petrarch was writing, the dominant educational system was the Roman Catholic Church. So if you were at all educated, it was most likely the Roman Catholic Church that educated you. And many times in that educational system, there was a focus on self-denial. Life was not to be fun for you. You would gain spiritual strength by denying yourself the pleasures of the flesh. So food, drink, making love, comedy, theater, literature, all these things tended to be frowned upon in terms of what you were to experience and what you were to learn to be a good human being. So you can see that the humanists were a radical departure from this. Life was to be enjoyed, and you were not to be humble, but rather to develop yourself, to develop to your full potential. Now, as I describe these things, I'm sort of kicking myself because I'm oversimplifying the way you were educated in the Middle Ages and what life was like. I mean, it wasn't all just groveling in the dirt or something like that. And there were certainly plenty of people who didn't live humbly in the Middle Ages. But I think what is accurate here are the values that were accentuated. Okay, so Petrarch, of course, got his inspiration for humanism based upon the way the ancients lived in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And if I could just focus on the Greeks specifically, they had athletics, they had the Olympics, they celebrated nudity. They thought the naked human form was absolutely beautiful. And so their statues of gods and goddesses are almost all nude. The Olympics, at the ancient Olympics, there were only male athletes and they were all entirely nude. You had great works of literature like the Iliad, the Odyssey. You had the poetry of Pindar and of Sappho. And all of these things celebrated warfare, love, heroism, victory, tragedy. And Petrarch was fascinated with this stuff because here was a whole culture that existed for, well, the Greeks hundreds of years, and then the Romans hundreds of more years. They celebrated this stuff. Their civilization was not based upon self-denial, but on self-celebration. So this is Petrarch's idea, humanism. And Petrarch is considered to be, quote, the father of humanism. And this is what humanism meant during the Renaissance in Italy. You do not deny yourself experience or knowledge, but rather you celebrate your life on earth. You learn the things you need to learn to develop your full individual potential as a human being, and you can draw your inspiration from how to live not from the current culture in the 1300s, but rather from the ancient past. Okay, so that's humanism. That was Petrarch's general outlook and what he advocated. Now, one of the things that Petrarch inspired then was, I guess, what I can call book hunting. So many of the great writings of the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, they'd been lost. And people who were interested in ancient civilization and were inspired by Petrarch, and if they had the means to do so, they literally went hunting for books. And here's how this would work. Paper back then being in both ancient times and in the 1300s in Petrarch's time, paper was a precious commodity. It's not like today where you get done with a scrap of paper and you just rip it out of your notebook and throw it into the recycling bin. You would never do that in the 1300s. They would reuse paper. So if there was paper with writing on it, sometimes that writing would be painted over, so it could be a new blank sheet of paper, or sometimes people would just write around what was already written and scratch out the old stuff. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, most of the people who are doing the reading and the writing are monks who live in their monasteries. And sometimes in the Middle Ages, they would have an old ancient text filled with ancient Greek, and the monks didn't pay it any mind. They thought, well, this is ancient pagan, pre-Christian stuff. It's worthless, but we need the paper. So these monks would paint over the old stuff or write around the old stuff to create their new Christian books. All right, so what this meant for the book hunters was those ancient books might still be out there. The writings of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, all that great poetry and all that history and philosophy, it might be out there. And likely if it is, it's in a monastery. We can go to the monasteries, we can sift through the books and see if we can rediscover some ancient writings. And these book hunters did this, and these book hunters sometimes found things. And one of the greatest stories of this involves this particular individual in the 15th century, in the 1400s. He was a priest, and his name was, if I'm saying his name right, Poggio. Poggio or Poggio, I honestly don't know how to say his name. But here he is, Poggio. And he was a priest, and he went to a monastery in Switzerland, and he couldn't believe what he found. Not only did he find a lost text of Roman poetry, but he found a complete book of text. Now, usually when people found things, when these book hunters found things, they found scraps, they found pieces, and they sort of had to, literally piece things together and guess what the whole story was. Not in the case of Poggio, who found this book in a monastery in Switzerland. It was a book from ancient Rome, so it's written in Latin. The Latin title was De Rerum Natura. Translated into modern English, it's called on the nature of things. And it was written by a Roman writer by the name of Lucretius. So Poggio begins reading this book and he can't believe what he's reading. An absolutely amazing work of literature. Here's what De Rerum Natura is. It starts off erotica. The goddess Venus, who is the goddess of love and sex, is inspiring love-making among all the plants and all the animals and all the everything. And then from that original, natural, primal, sexual force comes everything in the universe. And what starts off as a book of sex, erotica, ends up being a book of science. De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. This is a story about how everything in the universe works. So it's a science book, but it's also filled with paganism, with gods and goddesses of ancient Rome. And then underneath all of it, what's kind of with the life force that's driving everything in the universe is this sexual impulse. So this is definitely a very different type of book than what most people would be reading in the 1400s. And it's one of the only books that we have from antiquity that we have still preserved in its entirety. It's an amazing book. After Poggio finds it, and he finds it after the printing press was invented in Europe in the 1450s, this thing is going to become mass-produced, it's going to become a bestseller, and it is going to go on to inspire the High Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment. The professor of classical humanities at Harvard today is a man by the name of Stephen Greenblatt. And Professor Greenblatt of Harvard says that this book, De Rerum Natura, is the book that kickstarted Western civilization. If you're learning more about his story and what he thinks about this book, you can read his book, which is called The Swerve, which is about Poggio's discovery of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things. So there you go. This is what Petrarch is inspiring. This is what humanism is, and this is how we're creating a completely different culture in, well, specifically northern Italy in the 1400s. All right, so Petrarch inspired all this, and he lived again in the early 1300s. So he's 100 years before Poggio. Petrarch also lived in Florence in the Tuscany region. And so he had the greatest impact on the culture there. It was 100 years after Petrarch that an educational system was developed in Florence by a man named Leonardo Bruni that was based upon Petrarch's general idea of reviving the past. And Bruni simply developed a specific curriculum that was, or what we call today, scholastic humanism. And so at the beginning of this lecture, I asked for you to think about, if you wanted to create a great civilization, how would you force kids to study? What would you force them to study so that they would learn, and that would have this residual cultural effect? Because everybody had learned these specific things. And you could think, well, what today would, in the 21st century, what would you force people to learn during their teenage years or in their young adulthood years, college age and high school age? What would you make people learn so that when they all graduated, they would all be better human beings, and then civilization, our city as a whole would be a better city? So Bruni, based upon his ideas of Petrarch, or based upon the inspiration of Petrarch, said these are the 5 things that every person must study in order to consider themselves educated. And this is an interesting list to look at. The first, and I have to giggle when I identify the first because it's something I'm personally not very good at, is grammar. Understanding words, languages, sentence structure, being able to speak and write in an articulate manner. Grammar. The next, history. No surprise there. Petrarch said, in ancient times, people lived better than they do now. We need to bring back the past. Well, you got to learn what the past was. So, history. The third, I think this is very important in order to understand the culture that's being created in the Renaissance. The third one, rhetoric. So you can probably best understand rhetoric as public speaking and debate. So in these humanist schools, you would have the opportunity to develop your own ideas. What do you think is right? What do you think is wrong? And you would have to debate your ideas against your classmates. And this would sometimes be a very competitive thing. And sometimes your classmates or your professors would select who had the stronger, more logical argument. So this aspect of rhetoric is very important because there will be some very important debates that develop in the 15th and 16th century that really comes out of scholastic humanism in this new educational system. This is very much a break from the past in which you simply memorized facts. Humanism can be understood as a reaction against a previous educational system called scholasticism, in which you memorized facts and you regurgitated the facts. You can understand how a debate is much more dynamic and much more exciting and much more competitive. And that dynamic exchange of ideas really does a lot to influence the development of ideas throughout the culture as a whole, and it made the Renaissance a very exciting time. Okay, the next one, the fourth one, poetry. Now, today in the 21st century, I don't think there are too many teenagers who get all excited about poetry, although certainly there are a few. But the best way to understand poetry at this point in time in history, and throughout a lot of history, is it's music. And up through the 19th century, the best way to think of a poet is to think of them as being the equivalent of a modern rock star or musician. Somebody who could perform poetry in public and sell their books of poetry. These individuals tended to become celebrities. And whereas there's probably not too many of you who would ever just memorize a long poem so that you could perform it in public, because you'd think, well, I would be seen as stupid if I did that. Well, you wouldn't be seen as stupid back in Florence in the 15th century. You actually would be seen as extraordinarily attractive. If you could memorize long passages, dramatize it, turn a phrase on particular words in a particular way, you would be much admired. Being a poet throughout most of our study of European history was actually a pretty sexy thing. And the ancients certainly celebrated their poets like Homer, Pindar, Virgil, Sappho, and Petrarch wanted to bring those back, as did Bruni. All right, and then last but not least, moral philosophy sort of goes along with rhetoric, argument and debate about what's right and what's wrong. That's a very different break from the past. During the scholastic system, which was based upon you memorize facts, not with scholastic humanism. What do you think is right? What do you think is wrong? Who has the better moral argument? It makes morality, when you put morality to a debate, it makes it much more intellectually engaging and exciting, as well as potentially revolutionary. I mean, think of it like this. If your parents or teachers said, don't do this behavior because that's bad, it's one thing to submit to their authority and say, okay, I will not do this behavior, but because that's bad. It's something completely different if a parent or teacher says, I say you shouldn't do that behavior because it's bad in this way, and they explain it. And then you have the opportunity to argue and debate that. Well, you can understand how that might be subversive. So scholastic humanism is, in the way they're trying to educate people in Florence and Tuscany, is very new, it's very exciting, it's a challenge to how children were educated in the Middle Ages, and there it is. All right, now, who was allowed to be educated in Florence, or throughout Italy, or throughout most of Europe in the 15th century? Was it everybody? No, it was not. You had to pay for education, so your parents had to have had money. This would have been a minority of people living likely in urban areas like Florence who would have been educated in this way. This is important to history. We're talking about a minority, only a small minority. How small? I don't know. I don't have a percentage here. but it would have been a minority of people who would have been literate. They would have been able to read and write, let alone to know about the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, and to be able to engage in this type of intellectual development in this way. So that's important to know, because now think of the culture of Florence. A handful of educated people, a whole bunch of uneducated people, or at least not educated in this way. So the children of men who were farmers or unskilled laborers, they would not have had access to this type of education. Really, their only education beyond what they received at home would have been what they learned at church. And what you were learning at church, the stories from the Bible and such, are very different from these 5 things. So hopefully this is clear, because this will help us to understand a major shift that happens during the Renaissance. You've got a handful of really well-educated young men, and then everybody else who's largely illiterate and ignorant of these things, but knowledgeable when it comes to the stuff the Roman Catholic Church wants them to know. So the 7 sacraments, some stories from the Bible, etc. Okay, so hopefully you understand that division in society. All right, so I said a handful of young men. Well, what about the ladies? Were there any women who were able to receive this type of education too? Were there any female humanists? Did girls of the wealthy family have access to this type of education? All right, that's a great question. The answer is not a whole lot. The story of women throughout European history is a very important story. Throughout most of European history, no matter where you are in Europe, going up until the 19th century, that's the 1800s, women were the property of men, the legal property of men in most cases. As a girl, no matter where you were or what station in society you were in, you were brought up to be married off to a man and to be, for all intents and purposes, his domestic servant. Now, there were differences between wealthy girls and poor girls, because essentially you had to be trained differently to be the wife of a wealthy man versus being the wife of a poor man. And for wealthy young women who were expected to be married off to a wealthy man, and usually they were married off to a wealthy man for some sort of economic or political alliance between families, girls were frequently used as bargaining chips or as a way to create an alliance between 2 families. My daughter will marry your son, etc. But if you grew up a wealthy young lady, you would probably be educated in a particular way. You would never be allowed to be anything other than your husband's property, and he would certainly have his say over you. He would tell you what to do, but you might receive some sort of blue stocking education in which you learned how to read and learn how to write, and you would learn subjects that were considered to be proper and ladylike. You wouldn't learn philosophy or mathematics or science, but you might learn the works of literature. So throughout most of European history, when we talk about the story of women in European history, it's usually the story of women trying to break out of this system. The rebels, the freedom fighters. And these invariably are pretty inspirational stories. We'll also tell the stories of some women like, for example, Queen Marie Antoinette, who didn't really try to change the system at all, but rather learned how to emotionally cope with the system in their own unique way. But here at the dawn of the Renaissance, we get to learn the story of one of these freedom-fighting women, if I can call her that. I don't think she'd ever call herself that, but her story certainly is amazing. Her name was Christine de Pezan. She lived in the late 1300s into the 1400s, and her childhood it sounds slightly similar to Petrarch's. She was born the daughter of a wealthy aristocratic family, and she was born in Italy, but then she spent a lot of her childhood growing up in France. And she followed the traditional course of things. She was married off to a wealthy property-holding man, and she became his wife and his property. And they had several children together. And then at a relatively young age, her husband died, leaving her a widow with children to take care of. There were some individuals who owed her husband money that would rightfully belong to her, and she fought for that money. But, and maybe this isn't too surprising, she had some difficulty working with the courts to get that money, and she realized, I'm on my own. How do I take care of myself? How do I feed and protect my children? And this is one of those moments where you can wonder, what would I do if I was Christine de Pizan? Now, what probably everybody in society is telling Christine de Pizan is, find a wealthy man who's single. Find him, seduce him, marry him, get his money, and then you've got the security. And that certainly would have been the obvious choice for Christine de Pizan or any woman in her position at this point in time in history. And heck, maybe even still today. But here's where the essence, the soul of Christine de Pizan reveals itself. She doesn't want to get hitched to another man. She wants to be independent and free. But how do you do this as a woman in the late 1300s? Well, she's literate. She knows how to read and write. So she begins writing books of poetry. She has the connections as a noblewoman to get these books of poetry sold, and she begins making money as a writer. Guys, I can't tell you about how many women we're going to study in European history who have this story, who want to be independent, single women, not beholden to a man, but they've got to make money, and they choose writing as the way by which they can make money. Christine de Pizan is but the first. All right, so she writes books of poetry, and she makes money and acquires some economic security for herself and her children. Great. And she could have continued to just do that, but she doesn't, because there was a scholar out at the time who was writing and speaking about how history reveals how women are subservient and how they should only, be in the home taking care of their children and their men. That women are physically and intellectually inferior to men. And Christine de Pizan felt inclined to write against that idea. She wanted to say, no, history does not reveal that at all. So she wrote 2 books, and these are some of the first early works of feminism in modern European history. Her first book was called, and they both have similar titles, and they were both published the same year. The first book is called The Book of the City of Ladies. In this particular book, Christine de Pizan identifies major important females from all of history, going all the way back to biblical times. And some of these women are real women. Other women were like goddesses, or they came out of mythology, but they were all female characters. And she describes the strengths and the virtues of these particular women. And that's what the City of Ladies was to be, was this particular city where there were only these great ladies from history, and what an amazing civilization that would be. Okay, so this makes Christine de Pizan a humanist because she's reaching to the past to draw her inspiration for how life should be better lived today. In Christine de Pizan's case, with the Book of the City of Ladies, it's looking at all the great women from antiquity and bringing them back. So that was her first book. The second book, Treasure of the City of Ladies, is slightly different. It is an instruction manual for women of her day and age. So this would be for women who could read or write. So these would be for the women of the nobility. These would not be for women who were peasants. These would be for the wives of property-holding men. And it's an instruction manual. So it's a how-to book for how to achieve power and control over your life. Now, this is no book of revolutionary feminism. It's not, hey, let's overthrow the system, let's advocate for equal rights or something like that. Those ideas, they're not going to come along even for men for a while. I mean, the concept of rights doesn't exist yet as we know it today. So, but she wants to provide instructions for women. You're running a household. You've got your husband that you have to keep happy. There's a lot of work to do. Here's how you do it. And here's how you do it in a way that protects you. Here's how you make your husband happy, make him smile, make him give you space. And then she specifically talks about all the workmen who are going to be at the house, how you are in charge of them. So how you take care of the servants of the house and the workmen of the house in such a way that you have space and freedom. And that was Treasure of the City of Ladies, Christine de Pizan's second book. So were there that many women out there who were humanist in Italy during the Renaissance? No, absolutely not. They were the property of men. But Christine de Pizan, we have to look at with a great deal of admiration. She's certainly a great example of an early humanist. All right, so as I'm bouncing around here, I hope you are understanding, you feel like you have a good idea of what humanism was and how it was influencing the culture of especially Florence and the Tuscany region in the 1400s. Okay, now I'm going to bounce around history even more. Petrarch wanted to bring back classical civilization. What I would like to do now is go back to ancient Greece. Now, there is so much from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the entire classical world that Petrarch and the other humanists wanted to bring back, and I do not have time. I wish I had time, but I do not have time to go over all of that stuff. Man, it's such great stuff. But there are a few things that I would like to draw your attention to, because these are some things that go on to influence all of European history. So let's do this. Let's travel through time way back when. Petrarch wanted to go back to ancient Greece. So let's go back to ancient Greece to approximately 400 years before the birth of Jesus to learn about this guy, Socrates. Socrates is considered to be the father of a Western philosophy. Philosophy is a Greek word. Philo means love. Sophia means wisdom, so the love of wisdom. Now, Socrates certainly wasn't the first philosopher. There were a lot of philosophers that came before him in the Western tradition. They tend to be called pre-Socratics because they came before Socrates, and they developed particular ideas, which they taught. But Socrates is considered to be the first, or I guess I shouldn't use the word first, but the father of Western philosophy, because he didn't really create a system of belief so much as he tore down other systems of belief. So let me explain. Socrates was an old man in 5th century BCE Athens. He was a war veteran and a very respected war hero. And this old man loved argumentation. He loved debate. He was known as the gadfly of Athens. A gadfly is a big fly that flies up to you and bites you, and it's really annoying, and you swat at it, but you can't make it go away entirely. That's what Socrates was like. He would spend a lot of time in the marketplace of Athens, the agora, and he would enjoy confronting important people from Athenian society, important lawyers, respected teachers, artists, soldiers, and he would challenge them on ideas that they were supposedly experts in. So he would go up to a lawyer, for example, and say, "Hey, Mr. Lawyer, Mr. highly respected Athenian lawyer, can you define the word justice?" And usually the person who was forced into a conversation with Socrates would proffer up probably a rote answer, something you'd expect them to say, like, "Well, justice. Justice is when the law is fairly implemented. Those that break it are punished, and those that abide by it are rewarded. There's justice." And then Socrates would push back and try to have the person he's talking to explain things a little bit more clearly and more precisely. Okay, well, how do you know what a correct punishment is? Or how do you know a law is actually fair? And Socrates would keep asking question after question after question, badgering the person who he had forced in a conversation, until finally, usually the person that Socrates is interrogating just gives up. They get frustrated and they give up. And Socrates exposes that this important lawyer, this important judge can't really define the word justice, or this poet or this artist can't really define the word beauty. And Socrates becomes renowned in ancient Athens for exposing how nobody really knows anything. They're just sort of following the convention of their society. Now, Socrates himself never professed to know any better than anybody he was talking to. He couldn't define justice any better than the lawyer who bumbled over his words. But Socrates famously proclaimed that true wisdom comes to him who first knows that he knows nothing. Yeah, that's a mouthful. So let me say it again. Socrates said, true wisdom comes to him who first knows that he knows nothing. So this was Socrates, considered to be the father of Western philosophy because he questioned everything. He questioned everybody and everything. For me, the spirit of Socratic philosophy is really when you start questioning what things mean or why we engage in particular behaviors. There's sort of a, when you get down to the heart of everything, there's just sort of this big emptiness. You know, as a teacher, can I really define the word education? Well, if you press me like Socrates, probably not. So what am I doing? Well, I'm, to a certain extent, following a convention created by society of here's what education is, and I'm sort of playing along, and so are you. So, by the way, speaking of education, this method of Socrates interrogating people, today that is known as the Socratic method. So if you ever participate in a Socratic seminar, you will be expected to deliver an idea that you have, like here's like if you're asked to define happiness, you're like, here's what I think happiness is. And then other people would question that definition and ask for further definitions until it's finally exposed that you have no clue what happiness is. And it's a way of teaching, the Socratic method, where you essentially are just peppered with question after question after question. Okay, but Socrates eventually gets into a whole lot of trouble. Because he encouraged the citizens of Athens to question so much, he also encouraged them to question the existence of the gods. And because their polytheistic belief system was a state religion, questioning the gods was essentially treason, and Socrates was placed on trial as an old man. He was accused, in so many words, this was not the exact accusation, but in so many words, he was accused of being an atheist and for corrupting the youth of Athens. So he was put to death, or more specifically, he was forced to drink hemlock, a poison that killed him. Now, Socrates never wrote anything down. We have no written record from Socrates. Socrates didn't believe in writing things down. He thought that philosophy should never be written down because then it becomes something static. That philosophy should be this constantly developing organic debate. Socrates felt that if you wrote something down, then somebody would say, yes, that's truth, that's absolute, and it becomes like a religion. So Socrates didn't write anything down, so how do we today know about what Socrates did? How do we know about all those conversations that he had in the agora of ancient Athens? Well, because he had students, and they wrote stuff down. And the most famous of all of his students was a man by the name of Plato. And Plato's writings become very important during the Renaissance. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Plato's writings. First of all, Plato wrote in dialogue form. So his philosophy works read like a play. They're dialogues. So for example, you'll have a character like Socrates. Socrates is a character in almost all of Plato's works. And then you'll have another character. Let's say another character's name is Alcibiades. And so it's, Socrates says this, Alcibiades says that. Socrates says this, then Alcibiades responds. And so by writing in that dialogue format, Plato captured the Socratic method. He captured the debate and the argumentation between Socrates and whoever Socrates was talking to. Now, for me and for most readers, this makes Plato relatively easy to read in terms of philosophy. I mean, most books on philosophy, science, other works of dense nonfiction, they can be difficult to read. Plato's works are far more accessible because what you're reading is a conversation. Now, Socrates didn't believe in writing anything down, but Plato obviously did. And Plato is going to provide people with a specific way of looking at your world. Plato presents a specific perspective on nearly everything in life. Now, as I introduce Plato, understand, there's no way I'm going to be able to do justice to Plato here in just a few minutes. And you cannot underestimate the impact of Plato on Western civilization. The 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell said that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, meaning that Plato is the guy who came up with all of the original big ideas, the ideas we've been debating ever since. Okay, so with that in mind, here's how Plato looked at the world. Here's what he presented in his writings. Okay, the world that you see all around you, in your home, in your community, in your school, the people you see around you, the activities that they're engaged in, these things are not the real world. Yes, there is a deeper world than the world that we see in front of us. Plato felt that what we usually see and what we usually experience and the people that we interact with from day to day in our ordinary routine lives, these things tend to be very superficial. They tend to be not very meaningful. I mean, we're trying to eat food to keep our body alive for a little bit longer. We're trying to earn prestige with our peers. We're trying to make money for survival and for comfort. And these things Plato thought were just too superficial. And that beneath all of this superficiality of people and cars and walking around and going to school and going to work or going to restaurants or watching TV at home or whatever people do, all this was simply a veneer, a covering for what I will call the real world or the real universe. Now, Plato did not use that term, the real world. He used it, or rather, he used the term the realm of forms, but I don't have time to explain that one right now. My goal right now is just simply to give you a feel for how Plato looked at everything. So, Plato is essentially a spiritualist. He believed in the spiritual life, not in the physical world. So, okay, if Plato were here at Upper Arlington High School today, what would he say to you? How would he teach you as this great philosopher? Well, he'd probably ask you to identify what's important to you, and you'd say, well, having friends, getting good grades, and whatever else you'd say. And he'd say, okay, is that the real goal in life? And he'd begin this Socratic debate with you, where he'd get you to question, your motives, your goals, what you really want in life. And in so doing, he would convince you that you, like most people, are just sort of playing a game from day to day to day, and that there is actually a higher purpose of seeking truth and justice. And that stuff is not necessarily apparent to us in our day-to-day living. But you have within you the intuitive, philosophical ability to get in touch with this realm of forms, or this deeper world, this real world, this spiritual world, beyond the superficial stuff that most people are dealing with from day to day. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a feel for Plato. Again, this is just sort of a general description of how Plato saw the world. The stuff that most of us do from day to day, very, very superficial. A few people who think philosophically about things, they get in touch with a deeper spiritual world and develop more absolute and more perfect notions of things like beauty and truth and the meaning of life. So there's that. Hey, here's another way to think about Plato as well. Think of this. Imagine you're walking down the street and you see a man kicking a dog. And you're like, oh my God, that's awful. The dog's sitting there helpless, whimpering, and this brute of a man is just kicking him in the gut. And you are filled with revulsion, and you hopefully do something. Okay, where did that feeling of revulsion come from? Were you taught in school, kicking dogs is bad? I mean, maybe, but probably not. You just intuitively know that is a bad thing. Okay, Plato would say, okay, how did you get that in your gut instinctively? And Plato would argue, probably in so many words, although he probably would not choose these specific words, that this revulsion that came up from within you, that was your true spiritual self. And it's the part of you that's revolted by the awfulness of this world and believes in living a life more attuned to a more just and truthful spiritual world, a world that we can't really see in our day-to-day living. Okay, so that's Plato. Again, Plato will play a very important role in the Renaissance. All right, so Plato was very popular in Athens. He built a school in Athens called the Academy. Oh, he also really liked geometry. He liked geometry and mathematics as a whole because mathematics and geometry are perfect. They sort of represent this spiritual perfection, these pure forms that he believed existed in the spiritual world. I mean, it's 2 + 2 = 4 no matter where you are. It's absolute, it's unbending. And he thought our spiritual lives and the deeper spiritual world was like that too. Okay, so Plato was very popular, and he taught many students himself. And he will have one student that will go on to become just as famous as him, and that student's name was Aristotle. Now, Aristotle became a famous student of Plato because Aristotle disagreed almost entirely with Plato's worldview. Aristotle, first of all, was not from Athens. He came to Athens to study under Plato. He came from a region in northern Greece called Macedonia. And he was also the son of a doctor. He was the physician's son. And for me, that helps me to understand Aristotle and Aristotle's temperament a little bit, because Aristotle is not about the spiritual world. Aristotle is about the physical world. He's about the earth. Aristotle challenged Plato. Eventually, Aristotle was similar to Socrates, sentenced to death, but Aristotle decided to run away from Athens rather than drinking hemlock. He did form his own school, and he also was the tutor of Alexander the Great. And Aristotle was partially influential on Alexander the Great's thinking. So Plato is the spiritualist. Aristotle believes in science and logic. Science and logic. Aristotle wrote books on everything. He wrote books on plants and animals. He tried to categorize particular types of plants and particular types of animals. He wrote books on physics. He observed the way things moved and developed a scientific explanation that was based upon logic and observation. Here's why things move the way they do. He also tried to come up with a rudimentary table of the elements. He tried to discern what the basic building blocks of life were. Now, by the way, most all of Aristotle's ideas will first of all last a long, long time up and actually through the Renaissance, but almost all of Aristotle's ideas about movement and elements, they're all wrong. Aristotle is, and hopefully this makes sense now, he's considered to be one of the world's first scientists, but all of his science was wrong, or at least most of it was. But hey, it was a good first draft in Western civilization. But Aristotle also tried to tackle the big philosophical questions, like what is the meaning of life and what is happiness? He also wrote books on politics, on rhetoric, on metaphysics, and on all of these subjects, he tried to write as logically as possible. It makes sense that things should be like this because. So Aristotle's writings are very scientific and they're very logical, which makes them, in part, a lot more boring to read than Plato. But here we have it, the foundations of Western philosophy, as well as a fundamental conflict in Western civilization that persists to this day. Spirituality versus science. Plato and Aristotle presented two incompatible ways of looking at the world. Plato, the world that you see in front of you is not the real world. There's a deeper spiritual world that you need to get in touch with. Aristotle, the world that you see in front of you is the only world. Everything else is just speculation. So you should understand how that actual world in front of you functions, how it operates. Plato is the spiritualist, Aristotle is the scientist. All right, hey, if you're interested, Plato's most famous work is called The Republic. The dialogues contained in that book really get into how you connect with this deeper world of forms, and also how society should be governed by philosopher kings, because most people are incapable of doing philosophy and of understanding the deeper spiritual world, the world of forms, as he called it. For me, the best book that Aristotle wrote was called, it's his book on happiness and morality. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle's dad's name was Nicomachus, and his son's name was Nicomachus too, so this book might have been for his son and or his dad. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, he takes a logical, scientific view of happiness and also the meaning of life. And what he says is, this is just a really quick summary, but what he says is, when it comes to happiness, happiness is doing that which you are born to do. So you find your skill and you do it. So Aristotle would say to me, so you have a skill of being a teacher, so you are happy when you teach. Now I would say, come on, Aristotle, I'm probably more happy on the weekend when I'm hanging out with my family. And he would say, no, that's resting. If all you did was rest, you would never be happy. You are happy when you're doing the thing you were born to do. And when it comes to the meaning of life, Aristotle talks a lot about habits. So when it comes to, what is the meaning of your life, Aristotle would tell you, well, it's that which you do. It's not spiritual at all. It's very logical and very scientific. So what are you doing? What do you spend most of your days doing? If you spend most of your day sitting in your bedroom and playing video games, well, then that is the meaning of your life. That's what you do. You are that which you are in the habit of doing. So Aristotle encourages you to form good habits. Okay, so for the next 1,000 years, these two philosophers go on to influence much of Western civilization. Almost all of the science for the next 1,000 years, going up to the Renaissance and even past the Renaissance, is based upon Aristotle. Plato, many of his works get lost, but the idea, the fundamental worldview of Plato is absorbed into a new, young, growing religion called Christianity. And if you're a Christian today, it's actually really tough to figure out based upon the way you as a Christian look at the world. It's hard to separate what Jesus said from what Plato taught. Because Plato, even though he lived 400 years before Jesus, his ideas were so popular that when the Christians came along, Plato and Plato's philosophy was absorbed into Christianity. So even though so many of Plato's works got lost for a while in Western civilization, Plato's ideas continue on in Christianity. All right. So I mentioned how how Aristotle became the tutor of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great created a large empire spreading Greek culture throughout the Middle East. And while he was creating an empire, he named several cities after himself, the most famous and lasting of which is Alexandria, Egypt. And here in Alexandria, Egypt was a great place of learning. There was the Library of Alexandria. And for several hundred years in world history, this was the greatest center of learning on Earth. So we're talking about the last centuries of before the Common Era, BCE, and then the first few centuries into our era, the Common Era. And of course, there were no telecommunications back then. There was no radio, television, internet. People weren't walking around with cell phones. The best form of telecommunication that you had were letters, and that was highly unreliable. It's not like the Greeks or Romans had a post service. So if you wanted to learn something, you couldn't, like today, just reach into your pocket, pull out your phone, and look something up. You had to go to where that information was being taught. And Alexandria, Egypt, and the Library of Alexandria in Alexandria, that was the center of learning. That's where people went. And so it housed all of the knowledge. There were, of course, extraordinarily smart people who lived and worked there at the Library of Alexandria. For example, there was a man by the name of Eratosthenes who, doing nothing but measuring the length of shadows throughout the year, was able to correctly, within 500 miles, determine the circumference of the Earth. And he did that by measuring shadows. I mean, there were some really smart, incredible people there. But the scary thing is, you hold all the knowledge in one place. Well, what happens if this place gets destroyed? In the first century BCE, Julius Caesar, the great Roman emperor, was attacking Alexandria and accidentally During the battle, the Library of Alexandria caught fire. But it was over 400 years after that that the whole thing went down. The last administrator of the Library of Alexandria was a woman. Her name was Hypatia of Alexandria. By all accounts, she was most likely the smartest woman alive on the planet during her lifetime. She was a mathematician, she was a scientist, she was a philosopher, and people throughout history had flocked to the Library of Alexandria as this great center of teaching and learning. But so far as we know, it was almost always men who did the teaching and the learning, which makes Hypatia exceptional and exotic. She was a brilliant woman, but she was also a patrician. She was part of the wealthy class. She owned slaves. The Library of Alexandria was not just a library. It was also, as established by Alexander the Great, a sacred temple to a Roman god. And of course, this is no public education system. The only people who are going to the Library of Alexandria are the rich people, the patricians. And it's at this time in history, the 4th century of the Common Era, that small religion, Christianity, is starting to grow and grow and grow in the Roman Empire. Now, who becomes a Christian? Well, typically not the patricians. If you're part of the wealthy upper class, you're going to be part of the state religion. You're going to worship the Roman gods and goddesses. So who then becomes a patrician? Who then becomes a Christian? The lower classes, the plebeians, the slaves. Jesus had said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And there was, and there always has been, this revolutionary element of Christianity, because Christianity calls out to the poor and the oppressed. Jesus also said that it's easier to squeeze a camel through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And the Roman political and social and religious system by the 4th century, by the 300s, it was so corrupt and so unfair that Christianity became a political movement too. And there was a large growing Christian church in Alexandria. And the Christians of Alexandria that came from the poorer classes, and some of them were even slaves, they of course had never been able to access the incredible Library of Alexandria and what it had to teach. And it was also a pagan temple. So the Christians saw the Library of Alexandria as some place ungodly. And then the Christian bishop of Alexandria started preaching a particular quote out of the book of 1 Timothy in the Bible. He preached from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. In other words, women aren't allowed to teach. Women are simply to make babies and be good wives. So, thus inspired, a Christian mob attacked the Library of Alexandria. They burned it down. They captured Hypatia. They tore off her clothes. They flayed the skin off of her body using shards of pottery to do so. Then they tossed her naked, mutilated body onto a fire. This was the death of Hypatia and the end of the Library of Alexandria. Roman paganism is on the decline, Christianity is on the rise, and a great many works from antiquity were all lost. It's one of the worst moments in world history in terms of the loss of knowledge to humankind. It's why Petrarch and so many others during the Renaissance said, we have to bring stuff back, and a lot of stuff was destroyed, but maybe there's still some stuff out there. Maybe there's still some stuff that's yet to be found. Had the Library of Alexandria not been destroyed, my goodness, how humankind would have progressed. The famous American scientist Carl Sagan speculated in the early 1980s on a TV show called Cosmos that had the Library of Alexandria not been destroyed, it had the learning that was going on there continued under the new Christian era, then we most likely would have landed a man on the moon by the year 1500 instead of the year 1969. That science and mathematics was moving along that trajectory. But that wasn't obviously what was meant to be. Now, in terms of the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, some people blame the Christians because it was a Christian mob that took it down and killed Hypatia. But that's only one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is these were people who had been denied education. They didn't know any better. They had no clue what they were destroying. And from their perspective, from their point of view, this incredible university was nothing but a satanic temple. They really couldn't see it any other way. It's where the wealthy and powerful had access, but they didn't have access to it. There was a woman who was the head administrator of it, and according to their holy book, and the Bishop of Alexandria that kept accentuating this passage from their holy book, women don't have a right to teach. So the destruction of the Library of Alexandria is a major turning point in world history, Western civilization, and it's an important reason why the Renaissance has to occur. Throughout what we call the Middle Ages, what Petrarch called the Dark Ages, there was a great deal of intellectual development, especially in cosmopolitan areas where different religions, different worldviews were allowed to coexist and ideas could be exchanged. And Spain in the 1100s was one of these places. Now, if you remember, Spain in the 1100s was not Spain. Spain was, at that point in time, part of the Muslim world. It was Moorish Spain, or as it was called back then, Al-Andalus. It was ruled by Muslims, but there were still Jews and Christians who lived there as well. And in the 12th century, one of the greatest philosophers of the Middle Ages lived there. His name was Ibn Rushd. His name was later Latinized by Western scholars as Averroes, but most historians today refer to him by his real name, which is Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd attempted to combine and synthesize multiple different philosophies. Plato, what was left of Platonic thinking, and Aristotle. He was trying to synthesize a wide variety of different philosophies into one coherent system. He was a brilliant thinker in trying to know everything and synthesize everything that will go on to inspire other philosophers very similar to him, one of which we'll learn about later on in this lecture. And about 100 years later, in the Christian tradition, we have St. Aquinas. St. Aquinas was a Catholic monk who today is recognized as a saint, obviously, but during his time, he was actually a pretty controversial guy because he wanted to take the logical philosophy of Aristotle and apply it to Christianity. Okay, so why was this controversial? Well, because Christianity is a religion. And like most religions, you have the precepts of that religion, you have the ideas of the religion, you are taught these ideas and you accept them on faith. You don't really question how logical it is that a God would do this or that, or why you as a follower of a faith should do this or that. You just do these things on faith. You accept the mystery of God and what you are expected to do as a practitioner of that faith. Okay, so St. Aquinas, when he comes along, says, no, I can logically prove why Christianity is correct. I can logically prove how Christianity is correct. I can use Aristotle's logic to support the Christian faith. So let me give you an example of this. In the Middle Ages, in the 1200s, most people just accepted God existed. This is what they were taught. This is what they grew up believing. It's in their families and in their communities. It just was something that was not questioned by too many people. God existed. They took it on faith. Aquinas comes along and says, no, I can use Aristotelian logic to prove the existence of God. Not many people worried about this. And some church officials were kind of like, we don't really want to make this a logical argument because then people might feel inclined to find a weakness in the logic and attack it, and that's not good for the faith. But so here's an example. Aristotle had originally argued that there must be something that he called a first mover. And Aristotle's reasoning was this. Okay, you've got yourself. Where do you come from? Well, you come from parents. Where do they come from? Well, they come from parents. Well, where do your grandparents come from? Well, they had parents. Your great-great-grandparents. It goes back and back and back and back and back. And everything had a parent of some sort that gave birth to it. Even inanimate material came from someplace. Well, okay, how far back can you go? And Aristotle reasoned, you can't just keep going back and back and back and back infinitely. There must have been something that started off all of creation. There had to have been a creator. And Aristotle called it the first mover. The first mover meaning the first thing that set everything into motion, the first mover. St. Aquinas simply says, well, that's God. And St. Aquinas took 4 other arguments that Aristotle used, and he applied them to Christianity to support and to validate Christianity. All right, St. Aquinas' philosophy, which he wrote in his book, if you're interested, his book is called Summa Theologica. St. Aquinas' ideas that were very controversial at first, but then they became accepted, established beliefs that were taught in the Catholic school system for the next few hundred years. And I say few hundred because I honestly don't know specifically when it disappeared. And this way of this form of education was called scholasticism. Scholasticism. Scholasticism is a very boring type of educational system. All you do with scholasticism is you memorize these proofs. So there's no real discussion, there's no real debate. But as a good Christian, in the scholastic tradition, you learn these specific arguments. Here's why things are the way they are. And they can be religious, or they could be scientific. They're almost all based upon the ideas of Aquinas and Aristotle. So this is even though it's very scientific from the Middle Ages perspective. It's sort of the opposite of science today. So science today, you might memorize facts, but you're also encouraged to be skeptical, to ask questions, to try to problem solve. This is very much how science develops. But scholasticism, although scientific on the surface, does not contain these elements. It's simply the rote memorization of facts. So you would be asked, why does something fall when you let it go? And you would recite back, here's why. Here's a great and moderately famous image from the Middle Ages of a scholastic education. You see the teacher, the professor, sitting up at the lectern. He is all high and mighty, and he's looking down at all the students, and the students are sort of reading along with him as they memorize particular passages and particular arguments. But if you look closely, like some of the students are sleeping, others are talking and chit-chatting around, like they don't really care. They're very disengaged. And it's, of course, this type of classroom that is going to be challenged by the humanists that come around in Florence, in the Tuscany region of the Italian peninsula, not but 100 years after St. Aquinas dies. A lot had been going on in Florence throughout the Middle Ages, a lot of commerce, a lot of trade, especially the wool trade. Florence is located along the Arno River, which floats out into the Mediterranean. The wealthy merchants of the city tended to control the signoria, the city council. But Florence, there were several cities like this around Europe, but Florence was particularly lucky because a genius was born there. A poet by the name of Dante Alighieri. This was just luck. Sometimes it happens. Somebody is born in a particular time in a particular place, and so it makes that time and place a very, very special place. Dante lived from 1265 to 1321, a long time ago, when he was 9 years old, he fell in love. He fell in love, head over heels, passionately in love, with a girl named Beatrice. And he admired her from afar. She transformed his life. She was the most beautiful, most wonderful, most spellbinding thing he ever knew, in his whole 9 years of life. But he rarely approached her. He worshipped her from afar. And then, when they were teenagers, Beatrice died in a plague. And heartbroken and spiritually destroyed, Dante Alighieri decided to sublimate all of his pain and anguish into writing. And the first thing he wrote was a treatise on love called Vita Nuova, the New Life. And it's about how falling in love provides a spiritual awakening. It's as if God shows you his love through another human being that you fall in love with. And you must honor that human being for being the harbinger of God's love, for being a portal into another world of spirituality. Vita nuova. Whoa, what did I just say? That you discover God by falling in love with another human being? This doesn't seem like what's taught in Sunday school in terms of how you find God. You're supposed to find God by listening to your priest, by understanding what the Bible says. What's all this falling in love business? For Dante, falling in love is the greatest religious experience you can ever have in life. Vita Nuova, bestseller. But then Dante goes on to write his epic masterpiece, Divina Commedia, and I just butchered that in Italian. Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is an epic-long poem about Dante himself having a midlife crisis. The Bible says that if you live a good life, you live to be 70 years old, and Dante turned 35. And at age 35, he thought, I'm halfway done with my life. He has a midlife crisis. He's walking alone in the woods, and then he finds a porthole into hell, the Inferno, where he meets the Roman poet Virgil, who guides him through hell, who shows him all these people from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, people like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and other people who never were able to live to know the grace of Jesus Christ. And because they lived before the Christian era, they have to spend the rest of eternity in hell. But here they are, in various levels of hell, because some of them were worse than others. And then Virgil leads him through purgatory, limbo, the in-between area between the earth and heaven. It's where, as a Christian, when you die, you spend time in this in-between hell, this in-between world that's sort of like hell, where you get punished for all of your sins, and the sins get purged out of you. And then after Dante and Virgil spend time in purgatory, then Virgil leads them to the gates of paradise, where Virgil says, as a Roman poet, and as somebody who didn't know Jesus when he lived, as somebody who was not a Christian on this world, I am not allowed to see paradise. And so here's where I must let you go, Dante. So Dante goes into paradise all alone, but he's quickly joined by a new guide. It's his girlfriend is the wrong word. It's the woman that he admired most, Beatrice. And Beatrice shows him heaven, paradise, which is why this book is called the Divine Comedy. Divine in that it relates to all things of the afterworld, the way God set things up. And it's a comedy not because it's funny, it's not funny to read, but rather because it has a happy ending. Dante starts off, first lost in the woods having a midlife crisis, then he finds himself in hell, then purgatory, then heaven. Happy ending, Divine Comedy. Dante did a lot in Western civilization. First of all, he made the Florentine version of the Italian language, the Standard Italian, because all throughout the Italian peninsula there were a variety of different Italian languages that were spoken, but Florentine then became the standard. Also, Dante is describing in his poetry all of these ancient figures in this epic landscape of purgatory, of the Inferno, and of paradise. And it made people want to know, hey, who were these ancient people? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. This was also a poem. And in a day and age before recorded music, kids, in particular boys, began priding themselves on being able to quote long passages out of the Divine Comedy. This would make you very popular and very attractive. Think rock musician today. Even Leonardo da Vinci would astound crowds in Florence nearly 200 years after this by reciting long passages out of the Divine Comedy, and people would gather around to listen, to applaud him. And when Leonardo da Vinci's rival Michelangelo walked by, and Michelangelo was very different from Leonardo, he was very much asocial, in contrast to Leonardo, who was always the extrovert. Leonardo shouted out to Michelangelo, I challenge you to be able to recite as much Dante as me. And Michelangelo simply cursed him and walked away. So Dante, and the way he writes about love, and Dante, the way he writes about the afterworld, his incredible poetry, which incorporates so much of the ancient world into it. Do you see how he is inspiring the Renaissance? So Petrarch, who comes along a generation later, whose own life overlapped with that of Dante, who also comes from Florence, he inherits this worldview. And all he does, in a more straightforward way, is say, we need to all be inspired like Dante. Let's go back to the ancients. Let's bring it back. The generation after Petrarch came another great Florentine poet. His name was Boccaccio. Boccaccio lived through the Great Plague of 1348. That's Black Death. That killed nearly half the population of Europe. That was the bubonic plague. It was scary times. Boccaccio wrote a very long book called the Decameron, and the Decameron is about 10 teenagers, 7 girls, 3 boys, who during the plague run away from the city. They go out to the woods. So we have 10 teenagers, 7 girls and 3 boys, alone in the woods, hiding from the plague, who decide to entertain each other by telling each other stories. And each teenager tells 10 stories. 10 times 10 equals 100 stories in the Decameron. It's a big book, and hopefully you get a sense of where that prefix deca from Decameron comes from. 10 times 10. And these stories are lewd and funny stories. They usually involve monks and nuns having sex with each other. It was a bestseller. It's still widely read today, and surely an indicator that times are changing. 100 years after Boccaccio, in the year 1453, when our course officially begins, the Greek city of Constantinople, I guess more precisely, the Byzantine city of Constantinople, finally falls to the Ottoman Turks. Sultan Mehmet II, with his heavy artillery, super powerful cannon, blasts through the walls of Constantinople. Here come the Turks to take the city, and famously, they take the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Hagia Sophia, this icon of Constantinople. They build turrets around it, and they turn the Hagia Sophia Church into the Hagia Sophia Mosque. And the city is renamed Istanbul. Now in Constantinople were all of those monks of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and this was part of the Greek world. So many Greek texts that had been destroyed in the Library of Alexandria, that had been lost to much of the Western world, were still in Constantinople. And those monks, not wanting to be captured or killed by the invading Ottoman Turks, they fled westward, and they went to Florence, where the Medici family established a school for them, the Platonic Academy in Florence. Why do you think it's called the Platonic Academy? Well, because those monks were bringing Plato. Much of Aristotle had remained throughout the Middle Ages, but Plato, a lot of Platonic texts had been lost. So this is why Plato is important to the Renaissance. Because of the sack of Constantinople in 1453, here come these Eastern Orthodox Christian monks with their books, and in their books is Plato, and Plato's been gone for 1,000 years for most Europeans, and now here he comes back, and Plato is going to be read and taught in the Platonic Academy in Florence. By the way, you got to know ancient Greek to go to this school. One of those books by Plato that disappeared in Western civilization then reappeared after the sack of Constantinople in the year 1453 was the dialogue, the Symposium. When this book showed up in Florence, it shook things up. So in this particular dialogue, Plato writes about a symposium. What was a symposium? Well, a symposium was a banquet back in ancient Greece in which men would get together. They would have a party. This party would involve lounging around and talking, discussing ideas, while women, usually prostitutes, brought them food and a whole bunch of alcohol. The idea behind this symposium was this. In this fun, drunken atmosphere, you would be more likely to open up, to be completely honest about your feelings, about your beliefs, and the conversation and the ideas exchanged would therefore be much livelier than if you were just sober, talking academically in a classroom. So everybody would be expected to get very drunk. Also, there was the challenge among the ancient Greeks of who could get very drunk and still remain coherent. Who could be drunk but not be a foolish person. And this is the atmosphere of Plato's symposium. Socrates is but one of the men at this symposium, and the topic of discussion in Plato's symposium is love. What is love? So each of the participants in the symposium, they all get hammered drunk, and then they try to articulate what love is. Some of them talk about physical love. Some of them openly talk about homosexuality, which would have been very commonplace in ancient Athens, but something you would have had to have been secretive about in 15th century Florence. Also, you may have heard the term platonic love today, and that term actually comes from the symposium. This isn't necessarily Plato's ideal for what love should be. It was actually only one character in the symposium, and it was not Socrates, who was describing essentially finding your soulmate. It didn't necessarily imply a non-physical relationship, as that phrase does today, but that there is somebody out there who's your perfect soulmate who lives in the world. And it's your job to find that person. And during the symposium, Socrates decides to go last, watching everybody fall into a drunken stupor, and Socrates, no matter how much he drinks, of course, remains perfectly articulate and clear in both his speech and ideas. And whereas most of the men either leave and go home or pass out, Socrates stays up speaking lucidly through the night. And Socrates talks about how love is felt first as a physical thing, as an attraction to a physical body, and then it evolves into something spiritual. So love, physical love, is the gateway to a spiritual world. Sounds a little bit like Dante. So the symposium is reintroduced into Italy at around the same time in history that Lucretius's On the Nature of Things is also making a comeback and being reintroduced into Western civilization. And it's this stuff that's being studied by those fortunate young men of the wealthy aristocratic classes here at the Platonic Academy in Florence, which was established by the Medici family. Antiquity is coming back. The most famous student of the Platonic Academy was this man, from a very wealthy and prosperous family. His name was Pico della Mirandola. We remember him today simply as Pico. Pico was brilliant, he was super smart, he was a jack of all trades. He even worked as a spy for a period of time. And Pico, by studying Plato and nearly everything he could get his hands on at the Platonic Academy in Florence, wrote one of the great treatises of the entire Renaissance, Oration on the Dignity of Man. In this particular essay, this lengthy essay, Pico discusses that as a human being, you have amazing abilities and you rank higher than the angels. We owe it to ourselves and to humanity to educate ourselves by embracing the whole of history and religion and culture of all humankind. And this is what Pico endeavors to do in his oration on the dignity of man. He's very similar to Ibn Rushd of a previous age, in that he is going to take all of the knowledge of all of the religions, of every philosophy, even philosophies that seem contradictory, like Plato's philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy, and he is going to synthesize it all into one coherent philosophical system. If this seems dizzying, it is. And that's why Pico was considered to be one of the great geniuses of the age. But the best way to think about Pico is he's a great synthesizer. He wants to take everything and combine it all together. He takes Judaism, Islam, Christianity, paganism, supernatural magic, Plato's spiritual philosophy, Aristotle's scientific philosophy, and he wants to explain how it all works together, that all human beings are the same, or at least if not the same, their own individual belief system, be it like Christianity or Islam, their belief systems are compatible with every other belief system. He even, in Oration on the Dignity of Man, writes 900 theses. This is 900 thesis statements about how everything is compatible, 900 of them. And here we go with scholastic humanism, he invites anybody to come and debate him. And so there's your rhetoric of scholastic humanism. So that's Pico. And Pico was famous at the exact same time that these two young men were rising to prominence in Florence, Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici. So finally, guys, I bring us back to the Medici brothers. Sorry, that took a long time, but I hope the story up until now has made sense. I hope you understand the culture of Florence that these two boys grew up in. It wasn't just the family and the family business, but now you understand humanism. Now you understand the Platonic Academy and the influence it had on Florence. These guys would have grown up reading Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch. They would have been elitist. Only the wealthy aristocratic boys would be fortunate enough to receive this education. Females are to serve males, and most of the male citizens, or most of the male population, well, they work for the aristocratic classes in Florence. But to be part of this elite group of young men who are educated meant that you got to be incredibly well educated. And this education would have provided them with this new, rather progressive idea for what Florence could become. They dreamed of Florence becoming the next Athens, and they began calling Florence the New Athens, with their philosophers, with their artists. But now we need to return to the reality of these are two spoiled brats who inherited a whole lot of wealth and not a lot of interest in ruling. Remember, Giuliano's a bit of a party boy. He's the younger brother. The older brother, Lorenzo, he is more dour. He's a poet. He's more interested in poetry, music, and art. He doesn't really care that much about governing the state of Florence. So after their dad dies, and these two boys inherit the Medici business, and they don't seem to be made of the same tough stuff as their forefathers, why then they become targets. Just like there was the Albizzi conspiracy a generation before, it's now the Pazzi family that is going to try to take out these two Medici boys. And a brutal dual assassination is planned out for Easter Day in the year 1478. The motive of the Pazzi family is very simple. Take out the Medici family. They are our rivals. Take out the Medici so that we can have greater power and influence in Florence. We can have more money. So the assassination is planned out like this. If you want to take somebody out, you have to know where they're going to be at a particular place at a particular time. And of course, you want to catch them unawares. You want to get them with their guard down. And so the Pazzi the Pazzi conspiracy is going to take place during Easter Mass in the year 1478. So it's Mass. It's going to be held in the Florence Cathedral. We're familiar with the Florence Cathedral. The seating in the Florence Cathedral in 1478 was not democratic. If you were an important, wealthy person, you sat up front. If you were, not as important, you sat in back. And the Medici had their own pew. Now, sometimes people missed Mass, but Easter was an important Mass. So everybody's going to be in Mass on Easter Day of 1478. Now, coming into church at this particular point in time in history, you were frisked. You were patted down to make sure that you don't have weapons. Well, the hitmen who were assigned to do this job carried Bibles into the church, but they hollowed out the Bibles and they put in the Bibles their knives. So, when the prayer was being said and everybody was kneeling, eyes closed, heads down, the Pazzi assassins jumped up and went after the brothers. They got Giuliano. stabbed him multiple times. Giuliano, the younger brother, the party boy, he's dead. He had a wife, he had children. And then Lorenzo. Lorenzo was hit, he was stabbed, but he was able to pry himself away and to run and to get into some of the back hallways of the Florence Cathedral that he knew so well. And by that time, other congregates of the Mass had tackled the assassins. They were captured. Lorenzo de' Medici wounded, but not dead. He's alive. The assassins and conspirators were put on trial. When found guilty, they were hanged publicly in Florence. If you're looking at your screen right now, here is a drawing that a teenage boy did of one of the hangings. You might be able to tell if you're familiar with this particular artist's style of drawing. That drawing was done by Leonardo da Vinci. I don't know if Leonardo da Vinci was in the Mass on that day, but he did witness the hanging. And here's a drawing from one of the hangings. Now, Lorenzo, how did he respond to this? Well, the first thing he does is he adopts his brother's children and will raise them as his own. Lorenzo also has a wife and children of his own as well. Now, you remember Lorenzo's already a dark poet. This assassination attempt on his life and witnessing his brother getting stabbed right before him, or right next to him rather, this does not make Lorenzo de' Medici a more joyful person. He continues to have this idea of life being this really, truly fleeting moment where nothing of value remains. Lorenzo has a beautifully dark mind. But after this assassination attempt happens, he decides the time has come for me to rule. If he had have died and the Pazis took over, who knows what would have happened to Florence? So he really dedicates himself at this moment of time to turning Florence into the new Athens, and that he is going to be a great leader. Now, so in describing Lorenzo de' Medici's leadership style, I'm going to make a bizarre cultural reference here. So hopefully this makes sense, and I hope hopefully you can stick along with this. All right. So in the late 1980s, there was a popular action film called Lethal Weapon. And in this film, Lethal Weapon, there were two Hollywood stars that starred in it. There was Danny Glover and there was Mel Gibson. And Mel Gibson's character was an interesting one. He was a suicidal cop. He had a death wish. He didn't want to live. He was himself, he wanted to die. He saw no reason to go on with his life. And so his particular character in Lethal Weapon was the bad guy's worst nightmare. Because Mel Gibson's character was a cop with a death wish, he would come, rushing at you. And, it didn't matter if you tried to shoot him and kill him. He didn't care because he wanted to die anyway. And so he would do these extraordinarily dangerous things. That's what made the film so fun. Of course, he never gets killed and the bad guys always got caught. And that's Mel Gibson's character in Lethal Weapon. All right, so there's a bizarre cultural reference from my childhood. Okay. I think of Lorenzo de' Medici as like Mel Gibson's character in Lethal Weapon. Part of him has this death wish resignation that life is short and fleeting, nothing really matters, and what does it matter if I or any of us die? But along with that, he's also extraordinarily wealthy, and he loves the culture of the Renaissance. He believes in reviving antiquity and turning Florence into the new Athens. So after the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, Lorenzo de' Medici realizes that his family and his city is coming under attack. Other city-states throughout Italy, in particular the Kingdom of Naples to the south, has designs against his city-state. And if he doesn't do something, they're going to attack. So here's what Lorenzo de' Medici decides to do. In 1478 and into 1479, he goes down to the Kingdom of Naples with an entourage of courtiers and a whole bunch of gifts to meet the King of Naples. His advisors warn him not to do this, that as soon as he sets foot into the city of Naples, he could get captured, tortured, killed. Wide variety of bad things are going to happen to him because why would the King of Naples not do this to the head, the surviving leader of the Medici family? But here's where Lorenzo doesn't care. He wants to show the Kingdom of Naples that he's a lover, not a fighter, so he goes down there to meet the King of Naples to bestow upon him a multitude of gifts, of money, and to offer to the King of Naples, instead of warfare, friendship and trade. This was a very bold move, but Lorenzo de' Medici does it. The King of Naples accepts it. Lorenzo de' Medici does this with other neighboring city-states, thus bringing peace to Florence. No war, trade and prosperity. The fact that Lorenzo de' Medici had done this with his own wealth meant a lot to the people of Florence. But when he returns home, by Christmas of 1479, he presents before the Signoria a new piece of proposed legislation that says that he, Lorenzo de' Medici, will have full veto power over any law they make. So Lorenzo is not allowed to make laws, he's not allowed to present laws, but he is allowed to veto any law they make. So in other words, if you do something I, Lorenzo de' Medici, don't like, it's not going to happen. Given what Lorenzo de' Medici has done for the peace and prosperity of Florence, the Signoria agree. This makes Lorenzo de' Medici, now not indirectly but officially, a head of state. We can refer to him as a prince. He also receives a title. He is not officially called a prince or a king or a duke or any of that. He's simply called the Magnificent. Il Magnifico. Lorenzo is the boss of Florence. The other thing that he did to secure the safety and prosperity of his realm, which was a pretty traditional practice, he had some of his children married off into other very powerful families, both within the Tuscany region and outside of the Tuscany region. Two of his sons, one that he adopted from Giuliano and one of his own biological sons, will go on to become popes, and we will talk about both of these popes. Pope Leo X was Giuliano's son, and Pope Clement VII was his son. Now the 1470s roll into the 1480s, and now is when Lorenzo de' Medici does probably the most famous and lasting thing that he will do as Il Magnifico. He will patronize one of the most important artists of the Renaissance. And he doesn't just patronize him, he befriends him. These two guys become best friends. Sandro Botticelli and Lorenzo de' Medici. Sandro Botticelli was first hired by the Medici family to paint the Adoration of the Magi. Now, this particular painting is a biblical scene. It's the story of the three wise men coming to visit the newly born Jesus, to kneel down before Jesus and to present him with gifts. And that's the image that you're seeing here. But it's an interesting painting because what you're looking at are people dressed, not how people would have dressed during the time of Jesus, but rather how people dressed in Florence in the 15th century. And not poor people either, but the wealthiest of people. So we're bringing a scene from ancient times into the modern day. Now, more than that is going on in this particular painting. As the Medici family, and at this point in time, 1476, this is before the Pazzi conspiracy, this would be when Giuliano and Lorenzo were both alive, they would have looked at this painting and seen some very familiar people. The wise man bending down before Jesus is great-grandpa, the old patriarch, Giovanni de' Medici. There is also Cosimo de' Medici in the crowd. Then there's Giuliano de' Medici himself, and then there's Lorenzo de' Medici, and then even more boldly, Sandro Botticelli puts himself into the painting. Now, some people might consider this to be blasphemy. This is not really a celebration of Jesus or a scene from the Bible. This is a celebration of the wealthy patrons of modern-day Florence, modern day being, 1470s. This is surely this family celebrating itself. But the Medici love it, and Botticelli delivers. Now, after the Pazzi conspiracy, after Lorenzo is Il Magnifico, and Lorenzo can do whatever it is that he wants to do, he gives Botticelli free rein to paint whatever it is he wants to paint. And because Botticelli and Lorenzo are such good friends and they share a similar perspective on culture, and specifically on bringing back antiquity, Botticelli begins painting some increasingly controversial stuff, like this. This is La Primavera. La Primavera is Italian for springtime. This is a painting that is completely classical and pagan. You have wood spirits, you have little Cupid, you have a goddess of springtime, bringing forth new life. You have three beautiful women holding hands and engaged in some sort of ritual dance. There is a very worldly, sensuous, and erotic feel to this particular painting, springtime. The one thing you don't see in springtime, or La Primavera, is anything Christian. This is all classical paganism. And this was painted in 1482. 4 years later, Botticelli gets even more racy. The very famous The Birth of Venus. By the way, both of these paintings, they're in the Uffizi Museum in Florence today. They are huge paintings. They are the size of walls. Seeing these replicas on your little screen, they do these paintings no justice. And if you ever get the opportunity to go to the Uffizi Museum in Florence, you'll get a far better sense of the grandeur of these paintings. Okay, so here's The Birth of Venus. You know who Venus is, the goddess of love and sexuality. The Greek name for Venus is Aphrodite, and Aphrodite means born on the sea foam. So here's the goddess of love and sexuality being born. She's being blown into land by a zephyr wind, which is itself a man and a woman caught in an embrace. And the goddess of love and sexuality being blown into shore, covering herself up, but not really. And a female lady in waiting there on shore to greet her and to take a robe and to cover her up. But we get to see this whole image the moment before Venus gets covered up. We get to see her naked body. Why do you think Botticelli and Lorenzo de Medici, for that matter, wanted us to see the birth of the goddess of love and sexuality in the middle of the 1480s? Was this symbolic of a new birth of culture that they also wanted to have happen? A culture that is completely a rejection of the modest past, a rejection of the Middle Ages, a rejection of humbleness, of self-restraint, of denying the pleasures of the flesh. So The Birth of Venus is one of the most erotic paintings that has ever been painted in all of European history. And because of Lorenzo de Medici's power, there was nothing that the church in Rome could do about it. But it also probably symbolized the new culture of Florence in the 1480s. They're bringing back the pagan ancient past. They're turning Florence into the new Athens. Now, chronologically, in between La Primavera and The Birth of Venus, Botticelli painted this painting, which is not as famous as the other two. It's still fairly famous, but certainly, you've probably seen the other two, but not this one. But this is my favorite one to interpret, because there's multiple interpretations of it. There's just so much going on in it. So let's check it out. This is called Venus and Mars, and it was painted in 1483. And so take a moment to look at it. You're familiar with who Venus is and who Mars is. Venus is the goddess of love and sexuality. Mars is the goddess of warfare. And Venus is wide awake, and she's clothed, and she's looking over at Mars, and Mars is mostly naked and just knocked out asleep. And then you see these little creatures, these little satyrs, and they're playing with some of Mars's equipment. So they've got his battle helmet, they have his lance. One of them in the bottom right there is playing on his battle armor. One of them's blowing into a conch shell right into his ear, but Mars isn't waking up at all. I mean, he is out asleep. Okay, so what is this painting supposed to symbolize? And while I use this word symbolism, this is something that is left over from the Middle Ages in terms of artwork. Now remember, artwork in the Middle Ages was all symbolic and no realism. When you get to the Renaissance, you've got very realistic images. I mean, it's clear Botticelli is an amazing painter in his ability to accurately capture the human form, as well as plants and animals and other stuff. But it's not just a simple picture. You have to look at this and interpret it, just like you did with artwork in the Middle Ages. What is this trying to communicate? What does Venus represent? Mars represent? What do the satyrs represent? What's going on here? Okay, so here's the traditional interpretation of Botticelli's Venus and Mars. And true to Botticelli and Lorenzo de' Medici, it's a little lascivious and naughty, as well as, more profound in terms of its symbolism. But here we go. So Venus and Mars have just gotten done making love. And as it sometimes happens, the man's passed out asleep while the woman is wide awake. Now, Mars is the god of war, these little satyr-like playful creatures. They've gathered up his stuff and they're playing with it. So Mars represents war and he's knocked out asleep. The goddess of love, she is wide awake. And this is symbolic of the transformation of culture that is happening in the 1480s in Florence. The traditional manly virtues of being tough, of fighting, those virtues are asleep. And his instruments of war have now become toys. What's alive? What's awake? What's conscious? Love, beauty, sex. So that's Botticelli's Venus and Mars. Now there's another interpretation that's come along in the 20th century. Botticelli was a pretty amazing botanist too. If you notice, there's a lot of vegetation in all of his paintings, and art historians aren't necessarily good biologists. And botanists have been brought in to sort of inspect his paintings. And, was Botticelli just painting green things, or was what he was painting actually accurate in terms of things he would have seen in nature in the Tuscany region at that time? And botanists have been able to identify over 500 different types of flora and fauna in Botticelli's paintings that were painted with an incredible amount of accuracy, the same accuracy we see with human beings. And so in the case of this particular painting, Venus and Mars, there's one satyr who is at the bottom right-hand corner of this image, and his hand seems to be resting on a particular type of seed or nut or something organic. And so in the early 21st century, some botanists started studying it, like what could that be? And they looked at it and it was determined that that was something called Datura stramonium. It is the seed for a Datura plant, which is a plant that has, if ingested, hallucinogenic properties. So there's this new interpretation of this painting that suggests that at some of the parties, or in whatever context, Lorenzo and Botticelli might have been doing hallucinogenic drugs together. And Botticelli tucked the seed of one of these drugs under the hand of a playful satyr beneath a passed out Mars. So all this should reveal that in the late 15th century, things are kind of getting a little wild in Florence, and all this is happening under Lorenzo de' Medici's leadership. Now let's review the structure of society. Who would have been seeing these paintings? Well, this is the 15th century. There's only one painting. You can't reproduce these unless you actually repaint them. And they would have been in the palaces of Lorenzo de' Medici. So it would only have been a select group of people, the upper class, the nobility of Tuscany and the greater Italian region. Diplomats from other city-states would have come in to see this. But the majority of the people in the Tuscany region are still poor and uneducated, do not understand antiquity or any of these cultural changes that are happening. They are still traditional, conservative, good Catholics. But here's what they know. Their republic is gone. The signoria they are not the executive force of the city anymore. Lorenzo is a prince. He's making all of these cultural changes that the common person simply does not understand. And honestly, probably most of the commoners were downright disgusted with the decadent living that they knew Lorenzo de' Medici supported and engaged in himself. And for the masses of Florence and the people of Tuscany, who didn't care at all about the ancient Greeks and the Romans, but did care a lot about Jesus Christ, they found their inspiration not from Lorenzo the Magnificent, but from a friar, a traveling Dominican priest, whose name was Savonarola. At the same time in the 1480s that Lorenzo de' Medici is pressing for this cultural revolution, you have happening in parallel to that the rise in the popularity of this fiery priest. Savonarola will be most famous for an event called the Bonfire of the Vanities, but that doesn't happen until the end of the 1490s. We're still in the 1480s right now. His popularity is due to the fact that he is a fantastic, fiery orator. When he preaches, the people feel it, and he speaks their language. He is a good Christian. And he does not trust what Lorenzo de' Medici is doing to the culture of Florence. And the majority of the people understand Savonarola far better than they understand Lorenzo de' Medici or Botticelli and their entourage of wealthy, highly educated humanists. Savonarola is the anti-humanist. He is the populist Christian. So let's read some of the quotes from Savonarola's speeches, or sermons rather. He who says, "It would be good for religion if many books that seem useful were destroyed. When there were not so many books and not so many arguments and disputes, religion grew more quickly than it has since. There should be fewer books, fewer arguments, more faith." This is the anti-humanist perspective of Savonarola. Here's what Savonarola has to say about the ancient philosophers. "The only good thing that we owe to Plato and Aristotle is that they brought forward many arguments which we can use against the heretics. Yet they and other philosophers are now in hell." By this, Savonarola means that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and the other ancient philosophers lived in a pre-Christian time, therefore they did not know Jesus, therefore they could not have asked for Jesus to forgive them of their sins, so therefore they could never be in heaven, no matter how good of people they were in ancient times. And that the people of today in Florence shouldn't listen to them. The only thing we need is the Bible, no ancient philosophy. All right. Savonarola also speaks about the culture that Lorenzo de' Medici was creating in Florence. He says, "I cannot endure the evil doing of the heedless people of Italy. I must fight with all my strength to stop the devil from jumping onto my shoulders." And as it relates to this, Savonarola was himself an amazing person when it came to self-restraint. Like some other priests and friars and monks, he worked really hard on developing the power of his mind over his body. So he would wear a horsehair shirt, which would continually make him itch. It was this uncomfortable thing that he would wear underneath his monk's cloak that he wears. And so he'd itch all the time, but he would have to restrain himself from itching. And then also he would self-flagellate. So he would whip himself. He would inflict pain on himself to teach himself to overcome the pain. So Savonarola represents the exact opposite of the attitude of Lorenzo de' Medici and Botticelli towards the pleasures of the flesh. Whereas Lorenzo de' Medici and Botticelli celebrate these things, the pleasures of the flesh, love, sex, drinking, drugs, etc. Savonarola is all about traditional self-denial. And most of the people understand Savonarola a lot better than they do Botticelli or Lorenzo. Savonarola is seen as a much better, much more upstanding citizen than Lorenzo or Botticelli. Savonarola is seen as a man who's trying to restore the morality of Florence. And then Savonarola begins preaching ominous things. He starts suggesting that something bad is going to happen to Florence. And so here's what he says. "The sword of the Lord will descend on the earth swiftly and soon. The church will be reformed, but Italy will first be scourged, and her chastisement is imminent." So Savonarola starts preaching, and he's neither the first nor the last person in the Christian religion to do this, that something really bad is about to happen. Could this be end days? Could this be the anger of the Lord coming to get us? But the people are truly taken in by this, and he changes the culture of Florence. And he does so because he has the ear of the masses, in this way that's far more popular than Lorenzo de' Medici. And so Lorenzo de' Medici becomes very aware of Savonarola. Botticelli becomes very aware of Savonarola. And they realize the power that this man has over the hearts and minds of the people of Florence. And Lorenzo de' Medici was moved by Savonarola. Remember that Lorenzo de' Medici is, himself this dark, brooding poet at heart, far more than, he never wanted to be the ruler. He just wanted to embrace the arts. And so when Savonarola inspires most of the people of Florence to believe that Lorenzo de' Medici is essentially turning the city into something satanic, it affects Lorenzo emotionally. And we know this is true because in that big year in world history, 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici starts getting sick and dying. Now, as a good Catholic, because Lorenzo de' Medici, it's not like he ever renounced the Catholic faith, as weird as he got. As a Catholic, when you're dying, you want to see a priest, to have the priest hear your last confession and to administer to you the last rites. This will decrease your time in purgatory and help ensure a quick entrance into heaven. So Lorenzo de' Medici, as he is dying, and he knows he's dying, he could have called any priest to his bedside to hear his last confession. Lorenzo de' Medici called Savonarola to his bedside to hear his last confession. So Savonarola kneels by the deathbed of Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo de' Medici, the man that Savonarola believes has essentially de-Christianized Florence, has turned Florence into an evil city filled with decadent paganism. And now he has to listen to Lorenzo's last confession and to give him a penance and his blessing. Now, what actually happened between Lorenzo de' Medici and Savonarola is the issue of speculation. I mean, who knows what happens? There's one story that says that Savonarola doesn't accept the confession and just chastises Lorenzo de' Medici. And then there's the other story, and I tend to believe this second story, that Savonarola did his job. He heard the confession and, Christian to Christian, gave Lorenzo de' Medici his blessing. But when Lorenzo de' Medici dies near 1492, this marks a transition, both in the culture of Florence and in the Renaissance as a whole. With Lorenzo de' Medici dead, the Signoria is going to restore itself. Florence will once again become a republic. Lorenzo did have children, he had a lot of them, and he does have an oldest boy who would essentially be next in line to be the next magnificent of Florence. But that's not going to work out, and we'll learn about that in a minute. But with the Signoria back in power as the city council, and the most powerful voice in Florence being Savonarola, this vibrant, classical, pagan, Renaissance resurgence that's happening in the 1480s, it comes to an abrupt end. It's all over. And now there's a movement to re-Christianize Florence. So here's the next thing that Botticelli painted. It's pretty interesting. So Botticelli paints a scene from the New Testament. Lamentation over the dead Christ. So here's Jesus having been brought down off of the cross. He's dead, he's executed, and his mom and his disciples mourning over his dead body. So okay, what would Savonarola think of this? Well, this is an appropriate painting, Savonarola would probably think. This is not the goddess of sex, this is Jesus. It's an appropriate scene from the Bible. Yeah, but isn't it interesting, of all the scenes from the Bible, that Botticelli chose to paint this one in the year 1492? People weeping over their dead God. Most likely, Botticelli painted this to reflect his own grief over the loss of a close friend, Lorenzo. All right, so I said that Lorenzo had children. He did. Here's the next in line to take over. His name was Piero the Unfortunate. Yeah, he's not a great leader. Doesn't really inspire anybody. Savonarola had preached that the armies of God were coming to recapture Florence, and that's just because Savonarola was very familiar with the international situation. He knew that there was a country that was looking to invade Florence at the time. He simply just couched the international situation into religious terms. Piero de' Medici and his army tried to defend Florence, but they were unsuccessful, and Piero the Unfortunate and the rest of the Medici family ran away, leaving Florence open to invasion from France. France invades northern Italy in the year 1494 under the reign of the French king Charles VIII. Charles VIII doesn't live that long after this invasion. He is not all that significant to our telling of the story of European history. But here come the French. Okay, so why did the French invade northern Italy? Well, because it was just such easy picking. It was such low-hanging fruit. Northern Italy, in places like Florence, Milan, Ferrara, Venice, Romagna. These places were wealthy, and France was France. And there's going to be glory and wealth involved in this invasion for France, as at least that's how they see it. And so here come the French. And when the French show up and they conquer Florence for a brief period of time, Savonarola said, see, I prophesied this. This was ordained by God. So much decadent living, and this is what God will do to you, so get right with God. And because at the time, in 1494, people saw Savonarola for having accurately predicted an invasion of Florence as part of God's chastisement towards the decadent living of certain Florentines, he continued to grow in popularity. Now, on the international scene, some countries are concerned that France is growing and getting more powerful. So Spain, in response, trying to maintain a balance of power between France and Spain. Spain, which had recently, in 1492, became a unified country. They'd kicked out the last of the Moors from Granada. Isabella had financed Christopher Columbus's voyages. They're growing in wealth and power, and they're like, no, France, you're not going into Italy and taking over all of Italy. So Spain invaded the south of Italy, or the southern part of the Italian peninsula, specifically Sicily, the Kingdom of Naples, and I believe the island of Sardinia as well. And from the middle of the 1490s all the way through till the end of the 19th century, Spain will rule either directly or indirectly this whole southern half of the Italian peninsula. This helps enable Spain to spread their naval power across the Mediterranean Sea. All right, so the French do not, however, like the Spanish, continue to hold their power in the southern half of the Italian peninsula, but the French will eventually, Charles VIII will die, and the French will recede back into France. And in Florence, the Signoria are back in control, and Florence is a republic, and Savonarola is essentially inspiring and influencing the entire culture. And in the year 1497, at the end of the 15th century, Savonarola inspires an event called the Bonfire of the Vanities. It was during this event of February 1497 where Savonarola called upon all of the people of Florence to get right with God and to purge their homes of anything decadent. Fancy clothes, fancy jewelry, lewd artwork like Botticelli would have painted, those books from antiquity, anything that would have distracted you from being a good, focused Christian. A huge fire was held in the Piazza della Signoria, the downtown city square in Florence, and you would come to the fire and you would throw in clothing, jewelry, books, whatever. Now, to make sure that all of the houses of Florence were purged, Savonarola conscripted the help of his angels. The angels tended to be young men and their teenage boys. They wore a monk's habit, and they went door to door to door asking if you had anything in your home that was unchristian that needed to be tossed into the bonfire of the vanities. You may choose to give these angels some of that decadent stuff, but the angels would frequently just simply invite themselves in and start rummaging through your house. Sometimes what these teenage boys, these angels collected, made its way onto the bonfire of the vanities, and sometimes these teenage boys kept this stuff for themselves. Now, it wasn't just inanimate objects that were attacked during the bonfire of the vanities, but also particular individuals who were seen as advocating unclean, unchristian living. Women who had prettied themselves up too much with jewelry and makeup, and obviously, especially prostitutes. And then men who had become openly homosexual during the 1480s because Lorenzo de' Medici had no problem with that, especially since the Greeks had written about it so openly in works like the Symposium. These people were targeted. If you were a prostitute, you were brought out before public, and prostitutes typically were identified by their long, elaborate earrings, and their earrings would be ripped out of their earlobes. Clothes were ripped off of them, and so there was this public humiliation, a mild torture, and sometimes it was worse. Sometimes they were killed. Many homosexual men were killed. One man who was a homosexual in Florence who decided to leave long before this because he was not happy with the culture of Florence, and especially this particular development in Florence, was Leonardo da Vinci. He fled Florence for Milan, where the Duke of Milan hired him. Now, there was another homosexual in Florence. He was Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, he never acted upon his homosexuality. And so his homosexuality, or rather his sexuality as a whole, remains sort of a topic of speculation and discussion because he never really had a lover in his entire life. He is considered to be a repressed homosexual of the era. And he actually was an admirer of Savonarola. Michelangelo was devoutly religious and was one of Savonarola's early admirers. So this was the bonfire of the vanities. Now, 1492 is an important year. 1492, the year that Savonarola really began rising up in power and influence in Florence, the year that Lorenzo de' Medici died, which enabled this to happen. Because Savonarola started purging Florence of this new Renaissance culture, the Renaissance shifts from Florence down to Rome. And from here on out, the biggest patrons of the Renaissance are going to be the popes. And in the year 1492, there was a new pope. He was not considered to be one of the great Renaissance popes, but he actually did do a lot to improve the financial stability of the Roman Catholic Church and also the power of the Roman Catholic Church. But when we get to the year 1497, Savonarola does not like the Pope. Just like Savonarola said that Lorenzo de' Medici and Botticelli were immoral, decadent, disgusting men who weren't really true Christians. In 1497, Savonarola is saying the exact same thing about the Pope, and the Pope is his boss. This reveals how high and mighty Savonarola has become in his own mind. So, who was this Pope that Savonarola said was an awful decadent man and not a good Christian? All right. So this particular Pope, his name was Pope Alexander VI. He was Pope from 1492, that all-important year, until his death about a decade later in the year 1503. Pope Alexander VI is a different type of pope because he was Spanish. Most of the popes we talk about throughout this course are from Italy. They're Italian. There are a few notable exceptions, and this is one of them, Pope Alexander VI. His original name at birth was Rodrigo Borgia. And like I said, he was originally from Spain and then moved with his family to Rome to first become a high-ranking cardinal, and then eventually he was elected pope. Now, when I say he came from Spain to Italy with his family, I mean his children. The Pope had children. All right, so right there, that should cause some alarm because, as you may know, popes and all priests in the Roman Catholic Church are expected to be both single and chaste. So they're not allowed to marry and they're not allowed to have children. Now, that didn't mean, especially at this point in time, that popes didn't have love affairs. If they had a mistress, a lot of times she would be, she would be identified as a servant in his house. And if he had children, he would refer to them as his nieces and nephews, never as his sons and daughters. But for better or worse, Rodrigo Borgia, before he was pope, he didn't care about those pretenses. He simply said, these are my children. Of all of Rodrigo Borgia's children, these two are the most famous, Cesare and Lucretia. Let's take a moment to meet them now. Let's talk about first big brother Cesare. Rodrigo had encouraged Cesare to go into the priesthood. And for a while, Cesare was in the priesthood, but Cesare wanted to be a soldier. He loved fighting. He loved the military. He wanted the honor of fighting on a battlefield. And so eventually, Papa Rodrigo relented and said, okay, Cesare, allowed him to drop out of being a priest and to be a soldier, and specifically a general for the papal army. So when Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, his son Cesare was leading a papal army. So yes, the Pope had his own army to conquer neighboring lands like Ferrara to increase the size of the papal states. Cesare Borgia harbored this dream that he, leading a military force, could unite all of Italy under papal rule. Cesare is remembered for being extraordinarily cruel, probably a sociopath who had no problem inflicting pain and suffering on other human beings and seemed to enjoy it. To appease Cesare, some churches in Italy had paintings of Jesus done in the likeness of Cesare. Now, what did Jesus actually look like? That's hard to say. It's kind of scary to think that many of the images of Jesus that we have today are actually the image of Cesare Borgia, who was by all accounts a cruel and vicious man. Now, Cesare Borgia actually did, and this is kind of an interesting connection, he hired Leonardo da Vinci for a while. Leonardo da Vinci helped draw maps for Cesare so that Cesare could better know how to lay siege to and sack a town. But besides being a cruel and vicious warrior, there's another nasty element to Cesare Borgia. It is a legend, but it is likely true that he had an incestuous relationship with his younger sister, Lucretia. So Lucretia is the other famous Borgia child, and this is a rather interesting portrait that we see of her here. Lucretia was raised in probably a very similar way to most girls of wealthy families of the time, which was she was expected to be sort of a political pawn. She was to be married off to another family to bring an alliance between those two families. It is likely that before Lucretia was ever married off to another family, that she and her older brother Cesare were romantically intimate. It is also likely that when Lucretia was married off, that Cesare was jealous of Lucretia's husbands and in at least one situation killed a husband. Lucretia likely did not have the same affection for her older brother and spent most of her adult life trying to steer clear of him. So this is the Borgia family. And their dad, Pope Alexander VI, he's not that much better. He had multiple mistresses. That was not uncommon, but he used church funds to buy their apartments in downtown Rome. There was an event held during his papacy called the Affair of the Chestnuts, in which prostitutes were brought in from the streets of Rome to perform lewd acts involving chestnuts and to have sex with high-ranking church officials. We're talking bishops and cardinals and the Pope himself. So when Savonarola up in Florence says that the Pope is not a good Christian, I think many people would say Savonarola was correct. However, the Pope is still the boss of Savonarola. The Pope has a lot of power over Savonarola, and it doesn't matter how right you are and how wrong your boss is. If you are going to publicly criticize your boss, you better have some protection and support. All Savonarola had going for him was righteousness. That's really all he ever had going for him. Now, the masses had rallied behind him in the late 1480s and throughout the 1490s, but now, after the bonfire of the vanities and him calling out the Pope, there's nothing that being a popular friar can do for you when the Pope says, you are a heretic. You are not allowed to publicly criticize me. So Savonarola was put on trial. He was condemned as a heretic. He was excommunicated, which means he was kicked out of the church. He was not burned alive. The Pope was merciful to him in that. He was instead hung, which is, although still painful and awful, and not necessarily a quick death, is still a far better way to go than being burned. So he was hung first, and then his body was publicly burned in the Piazza della Signoria in downtown Florence in May of 1498. And that was the end of Savonarola. Florence then remains a republic, the Signoria now in more control, and Savonarola is seen by the majority of people in Florence as a martyr. And this is an important lesson to learn, both in life and before our next unit on the Reformation. Be careful criticizing your boss. Even if you are absolutely right and your boss is absolutely wrong, your boss has power over you. So if you're going to criticize your boss, you better have support. You better have a way of protecting yourself. And that's a lesson to be learned before our next unit, the Reformation, where once again the popes will be criticized. And Pope Alexander VI did quite a bit to bring in this next era of the Reformation. It's really hard to look at Pope Alexander VI and say this was a good Christian. He did do some good things for the church. Namely, he strengthened the political power of the church. The church brought in more money. So in terms of practical reasons, he did a lot of good for the church. But if you just sort of think of the church as a corporation, but in terms of his personal morality and his family, Pope Alexander VI is considered to be one of the most disgusting human beings in all of European history. And if not him, his son, Cesare, is just vulgar. Okay, so Pope Alexander VI dies in 1503. Our Spanish Pope, Rodrigo Borgia, he's dead in 1503. And the papacy passes to another individual for a very brief amount of time, just a few months, and then that guy dies. And then the next real successor for the papacy is a man named Julius II. He is pope for 10 years, from 1503 to 1513. And Pope Julius II is our Renaissance pope. He is the one who really brings the Renaissance to Rome. He becomes the patron of both Michelangelo and Raphael. Pope Julius II summoned Michelangelo from Florence down to Rome, where Michelangelo would paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He would paint, or fresco more technically, the wall behind the altar of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo would also design the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica. Julius II turned Rome into a Renaissance city through a creative taxation policy for the people of Rome. Pope Julius II cut your taxes if you were a citizen of Rome, if you made aesthetic improvements upon your home, initiated construction projects, or patronized the arts. And this was brilliant because individual wealthy Romans, who were incentivized by not having to pay taxes, or at least not as many taxes, spent far more on their homes or on patronizing the arts, which brought glory to themselves, than they ever would in paying taxes to the Roman Catholic Church. And so there was this financial boom time in Rome during the reign of Pope Julius II. Pope Julius II is also remembered as being the warrior pope, because after the death of Pope Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia is no longer in command of a papal army, there was naturally a resurgence of those lands that had been conquered by Cesare. They began fighting for their independence, and Pope Julius II, he didn't send any son to go fight. He actually led troops into battle himself. Now, that for some people is seen as a very unchristian thing, that the Pope should not be leading troops into battle. But it was a very different day and age, the 16th century. So that's Pope Julius II. We'll learn a little bit more about him in a future lecture on Michelangelo and then on Raphael. Let's take it back up north into Florence. What's going on there? Well, the Signoria is back in control, which means we have a republic in Florence. That lasts until the year 1512. The Medici family, using its connections throughout Italy, was in hiding, or if not officially in hiding, certainly not living in Florence, until the year 1512, in which Lorenzo II, the son of Piero the Unfortunate and the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo II gathers an army and invades Florence. In 1513, they get full support of the Pope for this invasion, but that's because the Pope in 1513, after Pope Julius II dies, is a Medici. His name was Pope Leo X. He is the son of Giuliano, the biological son of Giuliano de' Medici, and the adopted son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Pope Leo X, who is a bit of a spendthrift, is considered, or will be considered, in our next unit we'll learn more about this, he'll be considered one of the worst popes in the entire history of the Roman Catholic Church. Not because he was as vulgar as a human being as somebody like Alexander VI, but because of his complete mismanagement of the church. But he's a Medici, so of course he supports the Medici family taking Florence over again. I also want to briefly state here that Lorenzo II has a daughter named Catherine de' Medici, and she will be married off to the King of France. But this King of France doesn't last very long. He dies in a jousting accident, and Catherine de' Medici becomes the ruler of France. So man, these Medici, they hang around for a while. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about this event when the Medici take control of Florence once again in 1512, because it gives rise to one of the most important philosophers and books in the history of Europe and the history of the world. So it's 1512. Here comes Lorenzo II with his army. The Signoria, realizing what is at stake is their republic, they organize a military force to defend their republic. If the republic falls, then here comes Lorenzo II, who's going to be just like his grandpa. He's going to proclaim himself to be Il Magnifico, and he's going to be dictator over Florence. He's going to be a prince over Florence. And the republic is gone. So the Signoria appeal to the people. You are fighting to save our republic. Now, their republic wasn't really a democracy. It was only the wealthy who had the opportunity to select or elect a Signoria. But they also weren't a dictatorship, which is what would happen if Lorenzo II wins. So to defend Florence, the Signoria hired a humanist, a proud believer in a republic, and a scholar of warfare. And his name was Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was hired to defend Florence. But the armies of the Republic lost. Lorenzo II comes in to Florence. He takes over. There's no more Republic. He, as predicted, proclaims himself to be Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, just like his grandpa. Now, what about people like Niccolò Machiavelli that had led forces against Lorenzo de' Medici? Well, a lot of them, understandably, would have run away. I mean, what would you have done? You lost the battle. Here comes your enemy to take over your hometown. You're probably not going to hang out. Probably going to get out and try to find a home someplace else now. Niccolò Machiavelli did not. He stayed in Florence. Why did he stay in Florence? I don't know. I think it's because he loved Florence. And even though he was a firm believer in a republic and had written a political treatise in defense of a republic, Machiavelli, a humanist scholar who was very inspired by Aristotle's writings, and Aristotle had written about how the democracy of Athens was the greatest form of government possible, Machiavelli would have been no supporter of any type of tyranny, but yet he stayed in Florence. The fact that Machiavelli stayed in Florence made Lorenzo II very suspicious of him. Machiavelli submitted to Lorenzo II's rule. He did absolutely nothing to threaten him. But there was an assassination attempt on Lorenzo II's life. And when that happened, Lorenzo II assumed that Machiavelli was in some way, shape, or form behind it. Now, he has no evidence that Machiavelli was behind it. He just assumed that Machiavelli was behind it based upon who Machiavelli was, what he had written about, and what he had fought for in the past. So Lorenzo II sends his men now to capture Niccolò Machiavelli and to interrogate him under pain of torture. And here is how Machiavelli was tortured. This form of torture is called the strappado. And here is how the strappado works. Now, the image that you see here is a machine. You could do this by machine. You could also do this manually. Here's how it worked. You take the person you want to torture out into a barn or someplace where there's rafters, where there's a beam way up high on the ceiling. You take a rope, you throw the rope over the beam. You pull the rope down. You take the person you want to torture, you pull his hands behind his back, and you tie the rope to his wrists. And then you start pulling on that rope so that you hoist this person up. Now his hands are behind the back, so his hands are going to go up behind his back. This, even before he's off the ground, is going to cause excruciating pain. By the time you lift those arms all the way up, they're probably going to be getting pulled out of their sockets. And then you lift him up into the air a few feet. Get him up there, 10, 15, 20 feet. Get him way up. And then you release the rope. So he falls down. But before he hits the ground, you catch the rope, thus really jerking the arms out of their sockets. And then you repeat until the person begs for mercy and to be let down. And he tells you anything you want to hear. So most people begin talking. I can't imagine being tortured like this. Most people will begin talking even before they're off the ground. They're so scared of what's going to happen to them and the pain that they're going to experience. It's testimony to Machiavelli that he underwent this strappado of being pulled up and falling 6 times. They did this to him 6 times. Machiavelli never said a word. He never even whimpered a cry. Machiavelli is an amazingly tough human being. So after he didn't confess anything, he was declared innocent and they let him go free. Now, after enduring all this, here's what's even more amazing. Machiavelli could still use his arms. I'm sure there had to be some recovery period before his arms were healthy again, but he was able to use his arms again and to write. And he decided that he was going to write a book. This book was going to be an instructional manual for how to rule and how to be a successful ruler. This book, Machiavelli titled The Prince. And he wrote this book for and dedicated it to Lorenzo II. The Prince is one of the greatest works of political science of all times. It is one of the greatest books of the Renaissance, and it is an exemplary work of humanist scholarship. Here's what makes The Prince significant. So it's an instruction manual on how to be a good ruler, and by good, successful, a long-lasting successful ruler. Lorenzo de Medici, Lorenzo II, he's never been a ruler before. At this point in time, he's only 1 year into his reign. Who knows if it's going to last? Does he have the same skill and ability as his forefathers to be a great ruler of Florence? He doesn't know. So Niccolò Machiavelli writes him this book. Now, what's not in this instruction manual for how to be a great ruler is any type of idealism of what a good ruler should be. Niccolò Machiavelli, a true humanist scholar, he does not care about shoulds. He only cares about what works. So as you personally think about good leadership, as you think about the President of the United States of America, or if you think about, your parents, as you think about your teachers, as you think about a boss, somebody who has authority over your life, you probably think, well, here's how they should behave. Here's how they should make decisions. Here's how they should treat me. And of course, all of these shoulds are based upon what you would personally like. Here's the type of ruler I would like to have over me, because wouldn't life be great if they were like, if they acted like this? So they should act like that. Niccolo Machiavelli doesn't give a hoot for any of those shoulds. What Niccolo Machiavelli does is he looks at specific successful leaders in recent Italian history. And by successful, all that's necessary to qualify you as successful is you remained in power. That's it. It's not how nice you were. It's not how innovative you were. It was simply, did you remain in power? And that's what makes it a very new type of political treatise. Niccolo Machiavelli strips away all idealism and simply focuses on what works. Okay, so if Niccolo Machiavelli were around today and he had to look at a successful leader being somebody who has simply remained in power, I think he would look at Vladimir Putin. Putin was democratically elected the president of Russia in the year 2000. In the time since that democratic election, which was an honest democratic election, he was properly elected. There's no conspiracy behind that in the year 2000. There has been since the year 2000 because he's pretty much turned himself into a dictator. And he's probably the most powerful man in the world right now. So what did he do? How did he get there? I think if Machiavelli were around today and he'd say, you want to understand how to be a powerful, great leader, look at Vladimir Putin. Do what he did. Or something analogous based upon your own particular circumstance. Now, this seems weird given who Machiavelli was. I mean, here's a guy who was inspired by the Florence Republic. He was a humanist. He admired Aristotle and the Athenian democracy that they once had. But here's a man who's also very practical. Here's a man who has been tortured. And so he writes Lorenzo II this book, The Prince. Now, Machiavelli is not living in the world of the 21st century. He was living in Italy in the early 16th century. So he obviously does not choose, like I think he would, Vladimir Putin as the model prince. But guess who he does choose? Cesare Borgia. He identifies Cesare Borgia as the most successful leader of men in recent history. And if you, Lorenzo II, want to be a great leader of men, study what Cesare Borgia did. So Cesare Borgia is the inspiration for The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. Okay, so there are several very famous passages from this book. There are 3 quotes from this book that I would like for you to memorize. And I want you to keep these quotes memorized until the end of the year. So after May, you can forget them. But until then, memorize these quotes. And the reason why I want you to memorize these quotes is because this is such an important book of political theory that if ever you're doing a political analysis on any person throughout European history, you're like analyzing a leader, a political leader in an essay or something like that, you can always summon Machiavelli and evaluate how Machiavellian this particular leader is. But in order to do this effectively, you have to know specific passages out of Machiavelli's book, The Prince. Okay, so the first one is a quote you've probably heard before. It's very short and sweet. The ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. This particular quote has probably inspired many politicians and other people of influence to do many shady things throughout history. And the idea is this. If your end goal is power, then you do whatever it takes to achieve power. Does that mean bribery? Does that mean blackmail? Does that mean torture or murder? Then do it so that you can achieve the ultimate goal of power. Because once you then have power, then you can actually do good things with your power. But don't be afraid to be bad to achieve power. Because the ends justify the means. So don't be afraid to be cruel. All right, the ends justify the means. I want you to memorize that phrase. Okay, so the next 2 quotes you don't have to memorize verbatim, but you do have to be pretty close in terms of memorizing it for verbatim. So in other words, you need to learn the central idea here. Okay. The second phrase is this, and I'm just going to read it verbatim here myself. Okay. One ought to be both feared and loved, but it is difficult for the two to go together. It is much safer to be feared than loved if one of the two has to be wanting. Okay, so that's what Machiavelli says. Let me rephrase it like this. As a leader, you should be both feared and loved. So your people should love you, they should look up to you, they should admire you, but they should also be afraid of you. This is the best way to be a great leader. So you should strive for that. Strive to have your people both love you and fear you. But he says, if you cannot be both, then be feared. Okay, so this is the being feared and loved quote. And you need to memorize this however you can. A leader should be both feared and loved, but if he cannot be both, he should be feared. Now, for me, this is the partial, just a part of the passage. For me, this is, I think, one of the most interesting things that Machiavelli wrote, the whole passage, and I'll explain it here, because Machiavelli gets really, really psychological. He says something about us human beings and the way our minds work. He goes on to explain why it's more important to be feared than loved. Because if I think of a leader, I would say a great leader, a great boss, a great governor, president, whoever is an authority over me. I would say a great leader would be one that I loved, that I admired, that I looked up to. That would be the better leader, not somebody who I feared as a tyrant. But Machiavelli says, if you are in a leadership position, you actually want people to fear you more. And here's why. And he describes human psychology. He said, when people love somebody, they love them because they feel a sense of indebtedness to them. So a leader does something nice for them. They're like, oh, you're great. I want to be a good subject for you because you were so kind to me. But he said that that sense of indebtedness is not a powerful enough emotion, and that most human beings tend to forget acts of kindness. In contrast, what does motivate most human beings is fear of getting hurt in the immediate moment. So I have to think about what would motivate me more. If my boss was really, really nice to me, would I be a really good employee for my boss and do his bidding whenever he said? Or would fear be the bigger motivator? So if he threatened my job to fire me, if I didn't do something, would that motivate me more? And Machiavelli says it's the latter. You could think about this in terms of your own parents. What would motivate you more? Your parents do all these nice things for you, and then they say, hey, this weekend I want you to do a bunch of, yard work for me or something. Would you do the yard work out of a sense of indebtedness, or would a threat be more motivating? Like, if you don't do the yard work, then, I'm going to take away your cell phone and the car keys and all this. And no matter what you think, Machiavelli says, as a whole, humanity is motivated more by the immediate fear. Okay, so there's a lengthy explanation of that quote. A leader should be both feared and loved, but if the leader cannot be both, it is better to be feared. All right, last quote, and it's a long one. And how about if I don't even read this one, if I just summarize it? Machiavelli says that a leader should act both like a fox and a lion. All right. A fox and a lion. So a fox is sly. A fox is smart. A fox knows how to sneak up from behind you and get you when you least expect it. Those are the qualities of a fox. But a lion does not act like a fox. The lion is not subtle. Lion will charge at you from 200 yards away and then pounce on you and maul you to death. There's no surprise in being attacked by a lion. Or at least not for the purposes of this particular analogy. Excuse me. So Machiavelli says a great leader should know how to be, and know the times in which he should be sly and smart, cool and cunning like a fox. And then there are times when the leader needs to act like a lion, be bold, be brave, be daring, be aggressive. And that you cannot be like a lion all of the time, and you cannot be like a fox all of the time. You need to know when and how to act like a fox and when to act like a lion. All right, so there are Machiavelli's 3 quotes from The Prince. Can you remember them? Can you take a moment to close your eyes and remember that the ends justify the means? That a leader should be both feared and loved, but if he cannot be both, he should be feared. And that a leader, a prince, should be able to act like which 2 animals? A fox and a lion. And those are the big 3 quotes that I would like for you to learn from Machiavelli's book, The Prince. It's certainly not the last time we'll hear about that book in our study of European history. So we're in the High Renaissance time now, guys. So now's when we get to study some artwork. The great artists of the High Renaissance, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and we'll learn about those in their own separate lectures. All right, guys, so this concludes my recorded slideshow lecture, The Medici Apex and the High Renaissance. There was a whole lot in this. I hope you learned most of it. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'm always excited for your questions and comments, and I bid you a most wonderful day. Take care, Eurobears. Talk to you next time.